Section 28 of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jean Coleman. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation, A.D. 1545. Adolphus W. Ward. An important phase of history in the 16th century is summarized by Michele when he says that the Church of Rome, having lost a large part of Europe, not only ceased to lose, but actually regained nearly half of what she had lost. Michele is speaking of what is known as the Counter-Reformation, a reaction against the Protestant movement, which was rapidly spreading in Europe. By the Counter-Reformation, not only were the Roman Catholic losses largely recovered, but an increased zeal for the regeneration of the Church of Rome became fruitful of results. The reformation of the church from within had been often attempted by the ecclesiastical leaders. Several reforming councils had been held, but the desired object had not been accomplished. During the pontificate of Paul III, 1534 to 1549, the movement for regenerating the church, as well as for opposing the progress of Protestantism, was effectually inaugurated. At the Council of Trent, the new policy was definitely set forth. A general council had long been demanded by the Germans. Even many of the leading Italians had come to desire it. Charles V, who had his own reasons for temporizing the Protestants, had urged it year after year. Much as the domination of the emperor might be feared in such an assembly, Paul at length decided to comply. Twice he ordered the assembling of a council, 1536 and 1538, but the distracted state of Europe caused postponement. Meanwhile, owing to the continued progress of the Protestants, Paul and Charles came to an agreement that another summons should be issued. A few prelates were gathered at Trent in 1542, but owing to the emperor's war with France and the Turks, the Pope next year dispersed them. Finally, a papal bull summoned all the bishops of Christendom to Trent for March 15, 1545. The Pope showed much sagacity in calling this council at the moment when Charles and his inveterate enemy Francis I were concerting the suppression of the Protestants. On December 13, 1545, 3 legates appointed by the Pope held their public entry into Trent, and the council was formally opened. Paul III's continued desire to conciliate the emperor was shown by his adherence to Trent as the locality of the council, when the legates again urged the choice of a town on Italian soil. Yet the very bishop of Trent, Cardinal Madruccio, was a prince of the empire and by descent attached to the House of Austria, whose interests he consistently represented during the first series of sessions. The papal legates, with whose control over the council the emperor at the outset showed no intention of interfering, typified the different elements in the ecclesiastical policy of Paul III. The presiding legate, Cardinal Del Monte, afterward Pope Julius III, while notable neither for religious zeal nor for wise self-control, was a thoroughgoing supporter of the interests of the Curia. Cardinal Cervino, afterward Pope Marcellus II, a prelate of blameless life, was animated by those ideas of ecclesiastical reform of which Pope Paul had encouraged the open expression, but he was more especially eager for the extirpation of heresy and not over-scrupulous in the choice of means for reaching his ends. Lastly, Cardinal Pole's presence at Trent, in which some have seen a mere papal ruse, must have surrounded the early proceedings of the council with a hopeful glamour in the eyes of those who, like himself, expected from it the reunion as well as the reinvigoration of Western Christendom. Nothing, as had probably been foreseen at Rome, could have better facilitated the immediate establishment of the ascendancy in the council of the papal policy than the composition of its opening meeting. Of the 34 ecclesiastics present, only 5 were Spanish and 2 French bishops, and no German bishop had crossed the Alps, nor had any secular power except the Emperor and King Ferdinand sent their ambassadors. The business machinery of the council, which the legates lost no time in getting into order, was altogether in favor of their influence as managers. Learned doctors, without being, as in former councils, allowed to take part in the debates, prepared the work of the 3 committees or congregations, who in their turn brought it up for discussion to the general congregations. The sessions in which the decrees thus prepared were actually passed had a purely formal character, but before they were successfully held, opportunity enough was given for manipulation and delay. The voting in the council was by heads instead of by nations, as at Constance and Basel, and care was taken to refresh by occasional additions the working majority of Italian bishops, mostly in comparison with the ultramontane prelates, holders of petty sees. Some of these are even stated to have bound themselves by a sworn engagement to uphold the interests of the Holy See, though by no means all of the Italian bishops were servile curalists. Witness those of Chioggia and Fiesole. The council, in its second session, January 7, 1546, waived the form of title by which previous councils had implicitly declared their representative authority paramount. On the other hand, it boded well for the cause of reform that, by an early resolution, virtually all abbots and members of the monastic orders except 5 generals were excluded. Clearly, episcopal interest was resolved upon asserting itself. So long, however, as the German bishops were detained in their dioceses by the duty of repressing heresy there, while the great body of the French were kept away by the vigilant jealousy of their government, the episcopal interest and the episcopal principle were mainly represented in the council by the Spanish prelates, the loyal subjects of Charles. Their leader was Pacheco, Cardinal of Jaen. With him came eminent theological professors who in the early period of the council at least were without rivals. Domenico de Soto, whom Queen Mary afterward placed in Peter Martyr's chair at Augsburg, and Bartolomeo Carranza, afterward primate of all Spain and for many years a prisoner of the Inquisition. Through the emperor's ambassador, the accomplished and indefatigable, but not invariably discreet Mendoza, the Spanish bishops were carefully apprised of the wishes of their sovereign. The crucial question as to the order in which the council should debate the 2 divisions of subject which it had met to settle had to be decided at once, and the compromise arrived at showed both the strength of the minority and the unwillingness of the leaders of the majority, the presiding legates, to push matters to an extreme. Their instructions from the Pope were to give the declaration of dogma the preference over the announcement of disciplinary reforms, for it seemed to him of primary necessity to draw, while there was time, a clear line of demarcation between the Church and heresy, and for this, as he correctly judged, the assistance of the council was absolutely indispensable. The emperor, on the other hand, was still unwilling to shut the door completely against the Protestants, while both he and the episcopal party at the council were eager for the reformation of the life and government of the Church, which seemed to them her most crying need. Ultimately, it was agreed that the declaration of dogma and the reformation of abuses should be treated pari passu, the decrees formulated in each case being from time to time announced simultaneously. Taking into account the subsequent history of the council, one can hardly deny that this arrangement saved the work of the assembly from being left half done. nor was the progress made in the period ending with the 8th session of the Council, March 11, 1547, intrigues and quarrels notwithstanding, by any means trifling. On the doctrinal side, the foundations of the faith were in the first instance examined, and the whole character of the doctrinal decrees of the Council was in point of fact determined. When the authority of the tradition of the Church, including, of course, the decrees of her ecumenical councils, was acknowledged by the side of that of Scripture. Little to the credit of the Council's capacity for taking pains, the authenticity of the Vulgate was proclaimed, a pious wish being added that it should be henceforth printed as correctly as possible. At first, Pope Paul III hesitated about giving his assent to these decrees, which had been passed before receiving his approval, and showed some anxiety to prevent a similar course being taken in the matter of discipline by publishing a regulatory bull on his own authority. But on being more fully advised by the legates of the nature of the situation, he consented to allow the debates to proceed, provided always that the decrees should be submitted to him before publication. During the next months, April to June 1546, the work of the Council was accordingly vigorously continued in both its branches. In that of discipline, the episcopal and the monastic interests at once came into conflict on the subject of the license of preaching, and still more excitement was aroused by the question of episcopal residence, which brought into conflict the highest purposes of the episcopal office and the selfish profits of the Roman curia. The discussions on preaching ended with a reasonable compromise, monks being henceforth prohibited from preaching without the bishop's license in any churches but those of their own order. The question of residence was by the Pope's wish adjourned. Thus the Council, now augmented by Swiss and many other bishops, while all the chief Catholic powers except Poland were represented by ambassadors, could venture to approach those questions of dogma which the emperor would gladly have seen postponed, so long as he was still pausing on the brink of his conflict with the German Protestants. The Pope, on the contrary, while ostentatiously displaying on the frontier the auxiliary forces which he had promised to the emperor, was eager to proclaim through the Council as distinctly as possible the solid unity of the Orthodox Church. The doctrine concerning original sin having been promulgated in the teeth of imperial opposition, the legates pressed for the issue of the decree concerning justifications. In the midst of the debates, the Smalcaldic War broke out, July 1546. For a time, it seemed as if at Trent, too, the opposing interests would have proved irreconcilable. Pole, as the justification decree began to shape itself, had, for reasons of health, withdrawn to Padua. Madruccio and Del Monte exchanged personal insults. Pacheco accused the legates of gross chicanery, and they, in their turn, threatened a removal of the council to an Italian city, where, in accordance with what they knew to be the papal wish, the council might deliberate without being either overawed by the emperor or menaced by his Protestant adversaries. Soon, however, the case was altered by the manifest collapse of the latter, notwithstanding their expectations of support from England, Denmark, and France, long before their final catastrophe in the Battle of Mulberg, April 24, 1547. The emperor would not hear of the removal of the council to Lucca, Ferrara, or any other Italian town, and in consequence the plan of campaign at Trent was modified in order at all events to make the breach with the Protestants impassable. The debates on justification were eagerly pushed on, and after some further trials of finesse, the decree on the subject, which anathematized the fundamental doctrines of the Lutheran Reformation, was passed in the 6th session of Council, January 13, 1547. On the other hand, the decree on residence was again postponed, and a very high tone was taken toward the prelates absent from the council, the Germans being, of course, those principally glanced at. In the next session, March 5th, decrees followed asserting the orthodox doctrine of the Church concerning the sacraments and baptism and confirmation in particular, and with these was at last issued the decree concerning residence. It avoided pronouncing on the view which had been so ardently advocated by the Spanish bishops and argued by the pen of Archbishop Carranza, that the duty of residence was imposed by divine law, and it took care to safeguard the dispensing authority of the Roman See. Yet, though at times evaded or overridden, the prohibition of pluralism contained in this decree, together with certain other provisions for the bona fide execution of bishops' functions, has indisputably proved most advantageous to the vigor and vitality of the episcopacy of the Church of Rome. Paul III's attitude toward the emperor had meanwhile grown more and more suspicious. Partly they had become antagonists on the great question of church reorganization. Partly the emperor was becoming disposed to thwart the dynastic policy of the Farnese. Partly, again, the Pope now thought himself able to fall back on the alliance of France. In January, Paul III recalled the auxiliaries and stopped the subsidies which he had furnished to Charles V. And in March, Henry II succeeded to the French throne, whose intrigues with the German Protestants, though leaving unaffected his fanatical rigor against his own heretics at home, seem likely to break the current of imperial success. Thus, at Trent, the struggle against the Spanish bishops acquired an intense significance, and in the 8th session, March 11th, the legates at last made use of the power entrusted to them, it was said, 18 months before, and carried, against the votes of Spain, the removal of the council to Bologna on the plea of an outbreak of the plague at Trent. By the emperor's desire, the Spanish bishops, plague or no plague, remained in the city. The obstinate old man, said Charles, would end by ruining the church, and sanguine Protestants might dream of a renewal of the situation of 1526 to 1527. The progress of events widened the breach between the emperor and the pope. After Molberg, Charles V seemed irresistible, and as he would hear of no solution but a return of the council to Trent, there seemed no choice between submission and defiance. Gradually, however, it became clear that he had no wish again to drive things to extremes, and least of all to provoke anything of the nature of a schism. Moreover, France, where the Guises were now in the ascendant, was becoming more hostile to him, and the murder of the Pope's son at Piacenza, followed by the occupation of that city by Spanish troops, September 1547, nearly brought about the conclusion of a Franco-Italian league against Charles. But though French bishops arrived at Bologna, their attitude there was by no means acceptable to the Pope, and Henry II had no real intention of making war upon the emperor. Thus the latter thought himself able to take into his own hands the settlement of the religious difficulty. In the midst of further disappointments and of fresh designs, the immediate purposes of which are not altogether clear, Pope Paul III died, November 15, 1549. That the most generous of the aspirations which had under his reign first found full opportunity for asserting themselves had survived his maneuvering was shown by the favorable reception, both outside and inside the conclave, of the proposal that Reginald Pole should be his successor. But Pole refused to be elected by the impulsive method of adoration, and in the end the Farnese interest, supported by the French, prevailed, and Cardinal del Monte was chosen. The papal government of Julius III, 1550 to 1555, showed hardly more of temperate wisdom than had marked his conduct of the presidency at Trent. But he had the courage at the very outset to decide upon the safest course. After a few conditions, most of them quite in the spirit of the imperial policy, had been proposed and accepted, the bull summoning the council to Trent for the following spring was issued without further ado, November. Yet even before the council actually reopened, i.e. May 1st, 1551, it had become evident that the papal view of its purposes remained as widely divergent from the imperial as in the days of Paul III. The nomination of Cardinal Cresciento, a Roman by birth, as president of the council, two Italian prelates, Pegino of Siponto and Lippomano of Verona by his side was in itself ominous. German Protestants, upon whom the emperor pressed safe conducts at Augsburg 1551, perceived the papal intention of treating the council as a mere continuation of that which had previously sat at Trent. Still, several of them, as well as the Catholic electors, finally promised to attend. On the other hand, Henry II of France prohibited the appearance of a single French prelate and began to talk of Gallican council. Thus, the brief series of sessions held at Trent from May 1551 to April 1552 proved in the main, though not altogether, barren of results. Unless the assembled fathers were prepared to reconsider the decrees already passed and to force the assent of the Pope to a religious policy of quite unprecedented breadth, another deadlock was at hand. And already in the early months of 1552, the council, this time with the manifest connivance of Rome, began to thin. When in April, Maurice of Saxony, now the ally of France, approached the southern frontier of the empire, the Pope, whose own French war had taken a disastrous turn, had reason enough for shunning further cooperation with the emperor. The council dwindled apace in spite of the efforts of Charles V, who had never ceased to believe in his schemes. Finally, however, he could not prevent the remnants of the council from passing a decree suspending its sessions for 2 years, which was opposed by not more than a dozen loyal Spanish votes, April 28, 1552. Charles V's resignation of his thrones, 1554 to 1556, resulted, though far from being so intended, in a confession of his failure. While it was in progress, Julius III died March 23, 1555, leaving behind him scant evidence to support the rumor of his having indulged, at all events in the last period of his reign, in ideas of church reformation. But the choice of his successor, Marcellus II, April through May 1555, shows that these ideas were not yet extinct in the Sacred College. Notwithstanding the simultaneous creation by Julius III of 14 cardinals, for Savino had always been reckoned a member, though a moderate one, of the reforming party. Far greater, however, was the significance attaching to the election of the Pope, who speedily took the place of Marcellus. The pontificate of Paul IV, Gian Pietro Carafa, May 1555 through August 1559, forms one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the Counter-Reformation, which in him seemed under both its aspects to have secured the mastery of the Church. God's will alone, he was convinced, had placed him where he stood, for he was unconscious of having achieved anything through the favor of man. He was now 79 years of age, but he had never been more eager to devote himself to his chosen purpose, the establishment in the eyes of all peoples of a pure and spiritually active church, free from all impediments of corruptions and abuses, and purged of all poison of heresy and schism. Fully aware, though he had belonged to it himself, of the virtual failure of Paul III's commission of reform, Paul IV, in his first bull, solemnly promised an effectual reform of the Church and the Roman Curia, and lost no time in instituting a congregation for the purpose. The commission, which consisted of 3 divisions, each of them composed jointly of cardinals, bishops, and doctors, wisely addressed itself in the first instance to the question of ecclesiastical appointments. The new pope likewise issued orders for the specific reform of monastic establishments, and his energy seemed to stand in striking contrast with the hesitations and delays of the recently suspended council. But once more the seductions of the temporal power overcame its holder. Carafa's residence in Spain and enthusiasm for the religious ideals and methods prevalent there had not eradicated the bitterly anti-Spanish feeling inborn in him as a Neapolitan, and Charles V, returning hatred for hatred, had done his utmost to offend the dignity and damage the interests of the cardinal. To these personal and national sentiments had been added the conviction that the emperor's dealings with the German Protestants had encouraged them to deal a deadly blow to the unity and strength of the Church. And thus Paul IV allowed himself to be borne away by passion. His fiery temperament, fretted rather than soothed by old age, left him and those around him no peace. He maltreated the imperialists, cardinals, and the dependents of the emperor within his reach, and sought to instigate the French government to take up arms once more. Of a sudden, as if in another gust of passion, he made a clean sweep of the obstacles which his own perversity had placed in his path, and then took up in terrible earnest the work of church reform. He would allow no appointment savoring of corruption to any spiritual office. He would hear of no exception to the duty of residence. He completely abolished dispensations for marriages within prohibited degrees. Into the general management of the churches of the city, as well as into that of his own papal court, he introduced so strict a discipline that Rome was likened to a well-conducted monastery. But the agency which above all others he encouraged was that which his own advice had established in the center of the Catholic world, the Inquisition. From the Sacred College downward, no sphere of life was exempted from its control, and his intolerance extended itself to the very Jews, whose privileges in the Papal States he ruthlessly revoked. On his deathbed, he recommended the Inquisition with the Holy See itself to the pious cardinals surrounding him. It was afterward observed that many reforms decreed in its third period by the Council of Trent were copied from the ordinances issued by Paul IV in his memorable biennium. But inasmuch as during his pontificate the Church of Rome had lost ground in almost every country of Europe except Italy and Spain, his death, August 18, 5059, naturally brought with it a widespread renewal of the demand for remedies more effective than those supplied by his feverish activity and by the operations of his favorite institution. Personally, Pius IV, 1559 to 1566, was regarded and probably chosen as an opponent of the late Pope. His family history inclined him to the imperial interest, and he was understood to favor concessions in Germany with a view of bringing her stray sheep back into the fold. But in general, he furthered rather than arrested the religious reaction. Above all, the Inquisition, though he is not known to have done anything to intensify its rigor or augment its authority, went on as before. Karl Borromeo, the nephew of Pius IV, served the Holy See in a spirit of unselfish devotion and began those efforts on behalf of religion which in the end obtained for him a place among the saints of the Church, a position not reached by many popes' nephews. With the aid of this influence, Pius IV came to perceive that the future, both of the Church and of the papacy, depended on the spirit of confidence and cohesion which could be infused into the former, nor had he from the very outset of his pontificate ever doubted the expediency of reassembling the council at Trent. End of section 28, read by Jean Coleman, Salt Lake City, May 1st, 2022.
Section 29 of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Hudd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation, A.D. 1545, Adolphus W. Ward. Part 2. The Emperor Ferdinand and the French government, who persisted in treating the reunion of the Church as the primary object of the Council, at first strongly urged the substitution for Trent of a genuinely German or French town, where the German bishops, and perhaps even the Protestants, would feel no scruple about attending. But a totally free and new council of this description lay outside the horizon of the papacy. But Pius IV might have let fall the plan altogether, but for the fear of the entire separation in that event of the Gallican Church from Rome. In France, Protestantism had made considerable strides during the reign of Henry II, 1547 to 1559. About 6 weeks before the death of Henry, the first national synod of Protestants was held at Paris, May 1559. Under Francis II, the Guise influence became paramount, and the persecution of the Protestants continued. But through the suppression, just before this, of the so-called conspiracy of Amboise had temporarily added to the power of the Guises, it had also made the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, resolve not to let the power of the state pass wholly out of her hands. Hence the appointment of the large-hearted L'Hospital as chancellor, and the Assembly of Notables at Fontainebleau, August, where the grievances against Rome found full expression, and where arrangements were made for a meeting of the States General and a national council of the French Church. This resolution determined Pius IV to lose no further time. On November 29, 1560, he issued a bull summoning all the prelates and princes of Christendom to Trent for the following Easter. The invitation included both Eastern schismatics and Western heretics, Elizabeth of England among the rest, but neither she nor the German Protestant princes assembled at Nuremberg, nor the kings of the Scandinavian north would so much as receive the papal summons. In France, the death of Francis II, December 5, 1560, further depressed the Guise influence, and Catherine entered into negotiations with the Pope, with a view to concessions such as would satisfy the Huguenots, while approved by the French bishops. The Edict of January in 1562, which followed, long remained a sort of standard of fair concessions to the Huguenots. The first deliberations of the reassembled council were barren. The question which really came home to the fathers of the Church assembled at Trent presented itself again, when the sacrament of orders had in due course to be debated. The imperial and French ambassadors still cooperated as actively as ever, and the episcopal party, the Spanish prelates in particular, entered upon the struggle with a full sense of its critical importance. If the right divine of episcopacy could be declared, with its would-be established divine obligation of residence. Pius IV accordingly showed considerable shrewdness in instructing the legates at once to formulate a decree on residence which, while leaving the question of divine obligation open, imposed penalties on non-residents, except for lawful reasons, sufficient to meet practical requirements. But though such a decree was passed by the council, the debates on the origin of the episcopal office, which involved nothing less than the origin and nature of the papal supremacy, continued. November. And the critical nature of the discussion was the more apparent when, in the midst of it, there at last arrived nearly a score of French bishops, headed by the Cardinal of Lorraine. Hitherto, France had been represented at the council by spokesmen of the French court and of the Parliament of Paris. Now, the foremost among the prelates of the monarchy, whose abilities, however, unfortunately fell short of his pretensions, announced in full councillor assembly the demands of his branch of the Church. The recent January edict proved the strength of the Huguenots in France, and though the cardinal's first speech at Trent breathed nothing but condemnation of these heretics, it suited him to pose as the advocate of as extensive a series of reforms as had yet been urged upon the council. Further additions were made in the libel, which was shortly afterward, January 1563, presented by the French ambassador, and perfect harmony existed between the French and the imperial policy at the council. What decision then was to be expected on the crucial question as to the relations between the papal and episcopal authority? How could a recognition of the Pope's claim to be rewarded as Rector Universalis Ecclesias be expected from such a union of the ultramontane forces? The current was not likely to be stopped by the papal court, which about this time Pius IV announced on his own account at Rome. It seemed on the point of rising higher than ever when, in February 1563, the Cardinal of Lorraine and some other prelates waited upon the emperor at Innsbruck. In truth, however, a turning point in the history of the council was close at hand. The Cardinal of Lorraine had left Trent for Innsbruck with threats of a Gallican synod on his lips. Ferdinand I had arrived there very wroth with the council, and had received the Bishop of Zante, Commendone, whom the legates sent to deprecate his vexation, with marked coolness. The remedies proposed to the emperor by the cardinal were drastic enough. The council was to be swamped by French, German, and Spanish bishops, and the emperor, by repairing to Trent in person, was to awe the assembly into discussing the desired reforms, whether with or without the approval of the legates. But Ferdinand I, by nature moderate in action, and taught by the example of his brother, Charles V, the danger of violent courses, preferred to resort to a series of direct and by no means tame appeals to the Pope. The latter, indisposed as he was to support a fresh proposition for the removal of the council to some German town, urged by France, but resisted by Spain, which at the same time persistently opposed the concession of the cup demanded by both France and the emperor, saw his opportunity for taking his adversary singly. The deaths about this time, in March of 1563, of the presiding legate, Cardinal Gonzaga, and of his colleague Cardinal Serampando, both of whom had occasionally shown themselves inclined to yield to the reforming party, were likewise in his favor. Their places were filled by Cardinals Moroni, formerly a prisoner indicted by the Inquisition, now an eager champion of papal claims, and Nevergaro, a Venetian by birth, but not in his political sentiments. Moroni, though he had left Rome almost despairing of any favorable issue of the council, at once began to negotiate with the emperor through the Jesuit Canisius. The leverage employed may, in addition to the distrust between Ferdinand and his Spanish nephew, and the ancient jealousy between Austria and France, have included some reference to the heterodox opinions and the consequently doubtful prospects of the emperor's eldest son, Maximilian. In a word, the papal government about this time formed and carried out a definite plan for inducing the emperor to abandon his conciliar policy. The consideration offered for his assenting to a speedy termination of the council was the promise that, so soon as that event should have taken place, the desired concession of the cup should be made to his subjects. Ferdinand I, without becoming a thoroughgoing partisan of the papal policy, accepted the bargain as seemingly the shortest road to the end, which, for the sake of the peace of the empire, he had at heart. Thus, notwithstanding the continued opposition of the French bishops, the decrees concerning the episcopate began to shape themselves more easily, and the Pope, of his own accord, submitted to the council certain canons of a stringent kind, reforming in a similar way the discipline of the cardinalate. June. And when in the course of a violent quarrel about precedence between the kings of France and Spain, the latter, enraged at his demands not being enforced by the Pope, had threatened, by insisting on the admission of Protestants to the council, indefinitely to prolong it, the emperor intervened against the proposal. But the conflict between the papal and the episcopal authority seemed still incapable of solution, and, though Lyonès audaciously demanded the reference of all questions of reform to the sole decision of the Pope, and denounced the opposition of the French bishops as proceeding from members of a schismatic church, this opposition steadily continued in conjunction with that of the Spaniards, and still found a leader in the Cardinal of Lorraine. Yet at this very time a change began to be perceptible in the conduct of this versatile and ambitious prelate. The cardinal was supposed to have himself aspired to the office of presiding legate, and, though he had missed this place of honor and power, the condition of things in France was such as naturally to incline him in the direction of Rome. The assassination of his brother Francis, Duke of Guise, in February 1563, deprived his family and interest of their natural chief, and inclined Catherine de' Medici to transact with the Huguenots. The cardinal accordingly became anxious at the same time to return to France and prevent the total eclipse of the influence he had hitherto exercised at court, and to secure himself by an understanding with the Pope. A letter which about this time arrived from Mary, Queen of Scots, declaring her readiness to submit to the decrees of the council, and, should she ascend the throne of England, to reduce that country to obedience to the Holy See, may perhaps be connected with these overtures. Pius IV, delighted to meet the cardinal halfway, sent instructions in this sense to the legates, whom the recent display of Spanish arrogance had already disposed favorably toward France. Thus the decree on the sacrament of orders was passed in the colorless condition desired by the papal party. In a session held on July 15th, the Spanish bishops angrily declaring themselves betrayed by the French cardinal. Other decrees were passed in this memorable session, among them one of substantial importance for the establishment of diocesan seminaries for priests. Clearly, the council had now become tractable and might speedily be brought to an end. In this sense, the Pope addressed urgent letters to the three great Catholic monarchs and found willing listeners, except in Spain. Meanwhile, the remaining decrees, both of doctrine and of discipline, were eagerly pushed on. The sacrament of marriage gave rise to much discussion, but the proposal that the marriage of priests should be permitted, though formally included in both the imperial and the French libel, was now advocated only by the two prelates who spoke directly in the name of the emperor. But in the decree proposed on the all-important subject of reformation of the life and morals of the clergy, the legates presumed too far on the yielding mood of the governments. It not only contained many admirable reforms as to the conditions under which spiritual offices, from the cardinalate downward, were to be held or conferred, but the papacy had wisely and generously surrendered many existing usages profitable to itself. At the same time, however, it was proposed not only to deprive the royal authority in the several states of a series of analogous profits, but to take away from it the nomination of bishops and the right of citing ecclesiastics before a secular tribunal. To the protest which the ambassadors of the powers inevitably raised against these proposals, the legates replied by raising a cry that the reformation of the princes should be comprehended in the decrees. It became necessary to postpone the objectionable article, but now the fears of the supporters of the existing system began to be excited, both at Rome and at Trent, and it was contrived to introduce so many modifications into the proposed decree as seriously to impair its value. Then, though the Cardinal of Lorraine himself, during a visit to Rome in September, showed his readiness to support the papal policy, the French ambassadors at the council carried their opposition to its encroachments upon the claims of their sovereign so far as to withdraw to Venice. And above all, the Spanish bishops, upheld by the persistency of their king, stood firmly by the original form of the Reformation decree, and finally obtained its restoration to a very considerable extent. Thus the greater portion of the decree was at last passed in the penultimate session of the council on November 11th. With the exception of Spain, all the powers now made known their consent to winding up the business of the council without further loss of time. But Count Luna still immovably resisted the closing of the council before the express assent of King Philip should have been received. Nor was it till the news, authentic or not, arrived of a serious illness having befallen the Pope that the fear of the complications which might arise in the event of his death put an end to further delay. Summoned in all haste, the Fathers met on December 3rd of their 5th and 20th session, and on this and the following day rapidly discussed a series of decrees, some of which were by no means devoid of intrinsic importance. In the doctrinal decrees concerning purgatory and indulgences, as in those concerning the invocation of saints and the respect due to their relics and images, it was sought to preclude a reckless exaggeration or distortion of the doctrines of the Church on these heads, and a corrupt perversion of the usages connected with them. Of the disciplinary decrees, the most important and elaborate related to the religious of both sexes. It contained a clause, inserted on the motion of Lainez, which the Jesuits afterward interpreted as generally exempting their society from the operation of this decree. Another decree enjoined sobriety and moderation in the use of the ecclesiastical penalty of excommunication. For the rest, all possible expedition was used in gathering up the threads of the work done or attempted by the council. The determination of the index, as well as the revision of the missal, breviary, ritual, and catechism, was remitted to the Pope. Then the decrees debated in the last session and at its adjourning meeting were adopted, being subscribed by 234, or 255, ecclesiastics, and the decrees passed in the sessions of the council before its reassembling under Pope Pius IV were read over again, and thus its continuity, 1545 to 1563, was established without any use being made of the terms approbation and confirmation. A decree followed, composed by the Cardinal of Lorraine and Cardinal Madruccio, solemnly commending the ordinances of the council to the Church and to the princes of Christendom, and remitting any difficulties concerning the execution of the decrees to the Pope, who would provide for it either by summoning another general council or as he might determine. A concluding decree put an end to the council itself, which closed with a kind of general thanksgiving intoned by the Cardinal of Lorraine. The decrees of the council were shortly afterward, January 26, 1564, ratified by Pius IV, against the wish of the more determined Curialists, while others would have wished him to guard himself by certain restrictions. These were, however, unnecessary, as he reserved to himself the interpretation of doubtful or disputed decrees. This reservation remained absolute as to decrees concerning dogma. For the interpretation of those concerning discipline, Sixtus V afterward appointed a special commission under the name of the Congregation of the Council of Trent. While the former became ipso facto binding on the entire Church, the decrees on discipline and reformation could not become valid in any particular state till after they had been published in it with the consent of its government. This distinction is of the greatest importance. The doctrinal system of the Church of Rome was now enduringly fixed. The area which the Church had lost she could henceforth only recover if she reconquered it. Many attempts at reunion by compromise have since been made from the Protestant side, and some of these have perhaps been met halfway by the generous wishes of not a few Catholics. But the Council of Trent has doomed all these projects to inevitable sterility. The gain of the Church of Rome from her acquisition at Trent of a clearly and sharply defined body of doctrine is not open to dispute, except from a point of view which her doctors have steadily repudiated. And it is difficult to suppose but that, in her conflict with the spirit of criticism which from the first in some measure animated the Protestant Reformation and afterward urged it far beyond its original scope, the Church of Rome must have proved an unequal combatant had not the Council of Trent renewed the foundations of the authority claimed by herself and of that claimed by her head on earth. The effect of the disciplinary decrees of the Council, though more far-reaching and enduring than has been on all sides acknowledged, was necessarily in the first instance dependent on the reception given to them by the several Catholic powers. The representatives of the Emperor at once signed the whole of the decrees of the Council, though only on behalf of his hereditary dominions, and he had his promised reward when, a few months afterward in April, the German bishops were, under certain restrictions, empowered to accord the cup in the Eucharist to the laity. But neither the Empire through its Diet nor Hungary ever accepted the Tridentine decrees, though several of the Catholic estates of the Empire, both spiritual and temporal, individually accepted them with modifications. The example of Ferdinand was followed by several other powers, but in Poland, the Diet, to which the decrees were twice, in 1564 and 1578, presented as having been accepted by King Sigismund Augustus, refused to accord its own acceptance, maintaining that the Polish Church, as such, had never been represented at the Council. In Portugal and in the Swiss Catholic cantons the decrees were received without hesitation, as also by the Signory of Venice, whose representatives at Trent had rarely departed from an attitude of studied moderation, and who now merely safeguarded the rights of the Republic. True to the part recently played by him, the Cardinal of Lorraine, on his own responsibility, subscribed to the decrees in the name of the King of France. But the Parliament of Paris was on the alert, and on his return home the Cardinal had to withdraw in disgrace to Rheims. Neither the doctrinal decrees of the Council nor the disciplinary, which in part clashed with the customs of the kingdom and the privileges of the Gallican Church, were ever published in France. The ambassador of Spain, whose king and prelates had so consistently held out against the closing of the council, refused his signature till he had received express instructions. Yet, as it was, Spain, which had hoped and toiled for the achievement at the council of solid results, so it was here that the decrees fell on the most grateful soil, when, after considerable deliberation and delay, their publication at last took place, accompanied by stringent safeguards as to the rights of the king and the usages of his subjects in 1565. The same course was adopted in the Italian and Flemish dependencies of the Spanish monarchy. The disciplinary decrees of the Council on the whole fell short in completeness of the doctrinal, but while they consistently maintained the papal authority and confirmed its formal pretensions, the episcopal authority, too, was strengthened by them, not only as against the monastic orders, but in its own moral foundations. More than this, the whole priesthood, from the Pope downward, benefited by the warnings that had been administered, by the sacrifices that had been made, and by the reforms that had been agreed upon. The Church became more united, less awkwardly, and more dependent on herself. These results outlasted the movement known as the Counter-Reformation and should be ignored by no candid mind. End of section 29. Read by Tom Freya.
Section 30 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9 by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Protestant Struggle Against Charles V. The Smalcaldic War, AD 1546. Edward Armstrong. In 1530, Charles V convened a diet at Augsburg for the settlement of religious disputes in Germany in preparation for war against the Turks, who were advancing into the empire. The diet issued a decree condemning most of the Protestant tenets. In consequence of this, the Protestant princes of Germany at once entered into a league, known as the Smalcaldic League, from Smalcald, Germany, where it was formed. They bound themselves to assist each other by arms and money in defense of their faith against the emperor, and to act together in all religious matters. They concluded an alliance with Francis I, King of France, and from Henry VIII of England they received moral support and some material assistance. Charles was not yet ready to proceed to extremities. In 1531, terms of pacification were agreed upon, and the emperor received earnest support from Protestant Germany in his preparations against the Turks, who, after all, withdrew without a battle. During the next few years, there was no open hostility between the two religious parties, but all attempts at reconciliation failed. In 1538, the Catholic princes formed a counter-league called the Holy League, and violent disputes continued. At last, Charles determined to crush the Reformation in Germany by military force. The German Protestants refused to be bound by the decrees of the Council of Trent, 1545, because it was held in a foreign country and presided over by the Pope. Their attitude confirmed the emperor in his resolve, and in 1546 began the conflict known as the Smalcaldic War, of which Armstrong gives us a spirited and impartial account. War was actually opened neither by emperor nor princes, but by the Protestant towns. The capable condottiere, Sebastian Schartland von Württemberg, led the forces of Augsburg and Ulm briskly southward, seized Fussen in the Bishop of Augsburg's territory on July 9th, then surprised the small force guarding the pass of Arenberg, which gave access to the Inn Valley. The religious character of the war was emphasized by the plunder of churches and ill use of monks and clergy. Two obvious courses were now open to the insurgent princes. Either they could march direct on Regensburg, where a mere handful of troops protected Charles from a strongly Protestant population, or in support of Schartland they could clear Tyrol of imperialists, close the passes to Spanish and Italian reinforcements, and even pay a domiciliary visit to the Council of Trent. This latter was Schartland's program. The Tyrolese had Protestant sympathies and dreaded the advent of the foreign troops. Charles averred that even their government was ill-affected. Schartland would even have persuaded the Venetians and Grisons to forbid passage to the emperor's troops, and have enlisted the services of Ercole of Ferrara, the enemy of the Pope. But either of the two strategic movements was too bold for the Smalcaldic Council of War. The first would have violated the neutrality of Bavaria, in which the League still believed, while it had no quarrel with Ferdinand, who was ostensibly conciliatory. The towns, moreover, wished to keep their captain within hail, for they feared the possibility of attack either from Regensburg or from Ferdinand's paltry forces in the Vorarlberg. Schartland retired on Augsburg, but on July 20th, reinforced by a Württemberg contingent, occupied Donauwörth, and was here joined on August 4th by the Elector and Landgrave. The insurgent army now numbered 50,000 foot and 7,000 horse. The very size of this force, by far the largest that Germany could remember, is a disproof of the not uncommon assertion that Charles took the Lutherans by surprise. On a rumor that the enemy were crossing the Danube to separate him from the troops on the march from Italy, Charles moved on Landshut with some 6,000 men, not much more than a tenth of the opposing force. He was determined, he wrote, to remain in Germany, alive or dead, rejecting as idle vanity the notion that it was beneath his dignity to lead a small force. At Landshut, he met papal auxiliaries under Ottavio Farnese and Alessandro Vitelli, with detachments of light horse sent by the Dukes of Florence and Ferrara.
When the Spanish foot and Neapolitan cavalry had joined, he could muster at Regensburg 28,000 men, over whom he placed Alba in command. The Elector and Landgrave, in renunciation of their fealty, had sent in a herald with a broken staff addressed to Charles, self-styled the Fifth and Roman Emperor. To him was delivered the ban of the empire against his masters, condemning them, not for heresy, but for acts of violence and rebellion, for the Pack Plot, the attack on Württemberg, and the seizure of Brunswick. The campaign now began in earnest. While the Lutherans timidly wasted their opportunities, Charles, with his greatly inferior force, made a hazardous night march on Ingolstadt. The movement was executed with much disorder, resembling a flight rather than an advance. The League neglected the chance of making a flank attack on the hurrying, straggling line as it followed the right bank of the Danube until it was conveyed across the river at Neustadt. To add to the emperor's danger, his German troops were mostly Lutherans, hating the priests and the Spanish and Italian regiments. Many had early deserted from their general, the Marquis of Marignano. All cherished ill feeling against Charles's confessor as being the cause of the civil war. Even the population of Bavaria, professedly a friendly territory, was in great part a Lutheran. At Ingolstadt, Charles could draw supplies from Bavaria, whose neutrality the League had foolishly respected, and thither the Count of Buren with the Netherland army might find his way. He was by no means out of danger, encamped as he was with but feeble artillery outside the city walls. But the Lutheran princes, with all their bluster, had little stomach for stand-up fights. From August 31st to September 3rd, they bombarded the city with 110 guns, to which Charles's 32 pieces could make scant reply. They did not dare attack the impoverished trenches. "I would have done it," wrote the Landgrave, "had I been alone." On the other hand, it was reported that the Lutherans laid the blame on Philip, that he had refused to move, for every fox must save his own skin. The cockerel, as the confessor De Soto had contemptuously prophesied, had crowed better than he fought. Charles, on the other hand, was at his best. He rode round the trenches, exhorting his soldiers to stand firm, with the assurance that artillery made more noise than mischief. In vain Granvelle sent the confessor to persuade him that Christianity needed an emperor less gallant and more sensible. He answered that no king nor emperor had ever been killed by a cannonball, and if he were so unfortunate as to make a start, it would be better so to die than to live. When Ferdinand afterward expostulated with his brother, Charles assured him that his self-exposure had been exaggerated, but that they were short of hands, and it was not a time to set a bad example. The division of Lutheran command was already giving Charles the expected opportunities. The princes withdrew westward, a palpable confession of weakness. They had been the aggressors, and yet they now surrendered the initiative to Charles. Their retirement enabled the Count of Buren to march in with his Netherland division, and with him the troops of Albert and Hans of Hohenzollern. This march of Buren was the strategic feat of the war. He had led the hostile forces, which were watching him a dance up and down the Rhine, and slipped across it unopposed. He had brought his troops 300 miles, mainly through the heart of Protestant Germany, with no certain knowledge where he should find the emperor, for communications could only be maintained by means of long detours. Finally, he marched boldly past the vastly superior army of the League, which had professedly retired from Ingolstadt to bar his passage. Charles now took the offensive, pushing the enemy slowly up the Danube and steadily forcing his way toward Ulm. The strongly Protestant Count Palatine of Neuburg, Otto Henry, was the first prince to lose his territory, which indeed his debts had already forced him to desert. The Lutherans now showed more fight, and during the last fortnight of October the advance came almost to a standstill. Charles was ill, money and supplies were falling short, Spaniards and Italians were suffering from the cold rains of the Danube Valley. The papal contingent was demoralized for want of pay. 3,000 men deserted in a day, whereas the Lutherans were reinforced. Yet Charles, in spite of professional advice, refused to go into winter quarters. He counted on divisions in the League, on the selfish interests of the town, on the penury of the princes, and reckoned aright. The fighting was never more than skirmishing. Not arms, but ducats were deciding the issue. The fate of war was literally hanging on a fortnight's pay. The emperor had said that a league between towns and princes could never last. The financial burden pressed mainly on the cities, and they refused to raise further subsidies. The richer classes had always disliked the war. The great merchants were often, as the Fuggers of Augsburg, zealous Catholics. Trade was at a standstill, and they could protest that all of their capital was at the emperor's mercy, at Antwerp, at Seville, in the Indies, or else in Portugal. It was convenient to forget the brisk traffic which still continued with friendly lions. Zeal for the Lutheran cause seemed limited to a Catholic, Piero Strozzi, the Florentine exile, who in his hatred for the Habsburgs was vainly spending his fortune on revenge, striving for aid from Venice, negotiating loans from France. There was, moreover, no real solidarity between northern and southern Germany. Neither the Protestant princes nor the wealthy cities of the Baltic had as yet stirred a finger for the cause. Under any circumstances, the Lutheran army must have broken up. The leaders had resolved to retire to the Rhineland for the winter, live at free quarters on the ecclesiastical princes, and renew the struggle in the spring. At this critical moment, Maurice of Saxony came into action. Hitherto his conduct had been ambiguous. This was probably due less to deliberate deceit than to genuine hesitation. The incompetence of the Lutheran leaders and Ferdinand's expressed intention of invading Ernestine Saxony determined him. Persuading his estates with difficulty that it was necessary to save the electorate for the House of Wettin, he undertook to execute the ban in his cousin's state. His reward was the title of Elector and the Ernestine territories. The correspondence of Charles and his brother on the subject was characteristic of both. Ferdinand, always greedy of territory, had bargained for partition, but Charles persuaded him to be content with John Frederick's Bohemian fiefs. Charles, cautious and suspicious, was unwilling to grant the title until Maurice had proved his loyalty. Ferdinand, more impetuous, induced him to pay the bribe and give credit for the service. The Albertine and Austrian troops soon overran the defenseless land. This determined the manner of the Danubian campaign, and the Saxon phase of the war began. John Frederick must withdraw his troops to defend their homes, and he plundered en route the neutral ecclesiastical territories through which he passed. In a papal country, he told the burgomaster of Aschaffenburg, there is nothing neutral. The campaign of the Danube was suddenly over. Philip of Hesse retired sullenly to his 2 wives, as Chartland put it. As he passed through Frankfurt, he hoisted banners with the crucifix, flails, and mattocks, to incite the lower classes to revolt. He had failed to bend the powers above him, as he would fain stir Acheron. Charles could now complete the subjection of southern Germany. Granvelle, the last to be convinced of the necessity of war, was the first convert to the policy of peace, which the Landgrave and the towns desired. Peace would relieve the financial strain, and prevent the Germans from becoming desperate. Peace would enable Charles to turn his arms against the Turks. Charles thought it undignified to negotiate with an army in the field. Peace entailed the abandonment of Maurice, and henceforth no other prince would dare serve him. Augsburg and Ulm, if they were persuaded that he had no wish to establish a tyranny in Germany, were likely to capitulate, and after a victory his generosity in leaving Germany her liberty would appear the greater. Charles did not at this moment fear the Turk, and it was in his power at any moment to propitiate the French. Pedro de Soto urged continuance of the war to avert the danger of a papal-French combination, which would be the natural result of Paul's indignation at a compromise with heretics. The deserted princes and towns of South Germany now one by one made submission. Very pathetic was the emperor's meeting with the Elector Palatine, the friend of his youth, the whilom lover of his sister, the husband of his niece. Charles did not extend his hand. The Elector made 3 low bows, after which Charles drew out a paper which he read, and then spoke to him in French. "It has grieved me, most of all, that you, in your old age, should have been my enemy's companion, when we have been brought up together in our youth." The Elector answered almost in a whisper, and left like a skinned cat, the Emperor half raising his cap, but no one else. He was ordered to go to Granvelle, and the minister played the doctor and healed the wound. He returned with tears in his eyes, and then Charles forgave him. "My cousin, I am content that your past deserts toward me should cancel the errors which you have recently committed." Henceforth the old friendship was renewed. Ulrich of Württemberg escaped less lightly. He paid a large indemnity, received Spanish garrisons in his fortresses, and engaged to serve against his late allies. He had no resource, for his subjects hated him. From the windows of the cottages fluttered the red and white Burgundian colors, as a token of what was in the peasants' hearts. Ferdinand pressed warmly for a restoration of the duchy to Austria, but Charles replied that the aim of the war was the service of God and the revival of imperial authority. To seek their private advantage would only quicken the envy with which neighboring powers regarded the House of Habsburg. Farther north, the octogenarian of the Elector of Cologne resigned his see, and the evangelization of the Middle Rhine was at an end. Ulm gave in with a good grace, but Augsburg long delayed. Charles's original intention was, apparently, to garrison these towns, as Milan and Naples, with reliable Spanish troops, and perhaps to destroy their walls and dominate them by fortresses. But he treated the cities leniently. He left here and there companies of imperial troops, levied moderate contributions, replaced at Ulm and Augsburg the democratic constitution of the trades by the old wealthy aristocracies, but promised to respect the existing religion. Strasbourg, which, in spite of French entreaties, capitulated in February 1547, was almost exempt from punishment. It was feared that the distant, wealthy, and headstrong city might hold out a hand to the Swiss and become a canton. In southern and western Germany there was no longer an enemy in the field, but in the north Maurice's treachery had brought its penalty. John Frederick, acting with unusual vigor, recovered his dominions, received homage from the feudatories of Halberstadt and Magdeburg, and overran Maurice's territories until he was checked before the walls of Leipzig. When Ferdinand prepared to aid Maurice, the German Protestants of Lusatia and Silesia refused their contingents, and the Bohemian Utraquists made common cause with the Lutherans. The Utraquist nobility and towns formed a league in defense of national and religious liberties. They convoked a diet and raised an army. Ferdinand was faced by a general Bohemian revolt. His position was weakened by his wife's death in February, for it was pretended that he was merely consort. Only the Catholic nobles were for the Habsburg king. The roads were barricaded to prevent the passage of his artillery, and John Frederick, entering Bohemia, received a hearty welcome. The North German maritime and inland cities were now in arms, and the Lutheran princes of Oldenburg and Mansfield were threatening the Netherlands. Charles sent his best troops to Ferdinand's aid, and dispatched Hans and Albert Hohenzollern in support of Maurice. But Germans could still beat Germans. Albert was surprised and taken at Rochlitz. Ferdinand eagerly pressed Charles to march north in person. The emperor was unwilling, and Granvelle strongly dissuaded it. The dispatch of Alba was the alternative, but Charles did not trust his generalship. He was delayed, partly by gout, and partly by fear of a fresh rising in the Swabian towns. Here he had left 7,000 men, but he could not himself safely stay in Nuremberg without a garrison of 3,000, and could not afford to lock these up. His sole presence in the north, wrote Piero Colonna, was worth 25,000 foot, and Charles, ill as he was, must march. The unexpected turn which the war had taken in Saxony was not Charles' only trouble. Paul III had been alarmed by the emperor's progress, which had been more rapid and complete than he expected, and at the end of 6 months, for which he had promised his contingent, he withdrew it. The material loss was slight, but the whole aspect of the war was altered. Charles could scarcely now profess to be fighting for submission to Pope and Council, for the Council in March transferred itself after violent altercations with the Spanish bishops and imperial envoys to Bologna. Rome rejoiced at the successes of John Frederick. In the late French war, the Turks had figured as the Pope's friends and had spared his shores. It now seemed possible that the Lutherans might be the Pope's allies. It was certain that, if time were given, the Pope's defection would stimulate the active hostility of France. Charles must have done with the rebellion, and that quickly. Tortured by gout, and fearing that his forces would prove inferior to the Saxons, Charles moved painfully from Nordlingen to Regensburg and thence to Eger, where he was joined by Ferdinand, Maurice, and the Electoral Prince of Brandenburg. Spending Easter at Eger, he crossed the Saxon frontier on April 13, 1547, with 18,000 foot and 8,000 horse. 10 days of incessant marching brought him within touch of the Elector, who was guarding the bridge of Meissen. John Frederick had foolishly frittered away his forces in Saxon and Bohemian garrisons. He now burned the bridge and retired down the Elbe to Mühlberg, hoping to concentrate his scattered forces under the walls of Wittenberg, while his bridge of boats would keep open communications with the left bank. Charles was too quick for the ponderous Elector. He marched at midnight on April 23-24, and at 9 a.m. reached the Elbe, nearly opposite Mühlberg. As the mist cleared, Alba's light horse descried the bridge of boats swinging from the farther bank, and a dozen Spaniards, covered by an arquebus fire, swam the river with swords between their teeth, routed the guard, and brought the boats across. Meanwhile, Alba and Maurice found a ford by which the light horse crossed with arquebusiers in group. Charles and Ferdinand followed, with the water up to the girths, the emperor pale as death and thin as a skeleton. The Elector, after attending his Sunday sermon, was enjoying his breakfast. He made no attempt to defend his strong position on the higher bank, but withdrew his guns and infantry, covering the retreat in person with his cavalry. The bulk of the imperial forces had crossed by the bridge of boats, and the day was passed in a running rearguard action. It was a long-drawn sunset, and not till between 6 and 7 did Alba, as ever making sure, deliver his decisive attack. The Saxon horse had turned fiercely on the pursuing light cavalry some 9 miles from Mühlberg, and then the Imperialists, striking home, converted the retreat into a headlong flight. More than a third of the Saxon forces were left upon the field. The whole of their artillery and baggage train was taken. John Frederick regained his timid generalship by his personal bravery. Left almost single-handed in the wood through which his troops retired, he slashed at the Neapolitan light horsemen and Hungarian hussars who surrounded him, but at length surrendered to Ippolito da Porta of Vicenza, who led him, his forehead streaming with blood, to Charles. Of the interview between the emperor and his enemy there are several versions, but none inconsistent. "Most powerful and gracious emperor," said the elector, vainly endeavoring to dismount, "I am your prisoner." "You recognize me as emperor now?" rejoined Charles. "I am today a poor prisoner. May it please your majesty to serve me as a born prince." "I will treat you as you deserve," said Charles. "Then," broke in Ferdinand, "you have tried to drive me and my children from our lands." The evidence as to the angry scene seems conclusive. Charles had been 21 hours in the saddle. He had been exasperated by the insolence of the princess, who had addressed him as Charles of Ghent, self-styled emperor. Yet his harsh reception of a wounded prisoner contrasts unpleasantly with the generosity which his biographers have ascribed to him. Muhlberg was a little more than a skirmish, and yet it was decisive. In a far more murderous battle, the imperialists were beaten. The forces of the maritime towns had compelled Eric of Brunswick to raise the siege of Bremen, and on his retreat had defeated him near Drakenberg with a heavy loss. But victories belated or premature do not turn the scale against an opportune success. The sole result of the battle was to delay the Landgrave's surrender a little longer. Philip had sworn to die like a mad dog before he would surrender his fortresses, but he yielded ultimately without a blow. He found discontent rife among his nobles. He was threatened alike from the Netherlands and by the Count of Buren. For months he wavered between capitulation and resistance. Arras assured the nuncio that he was a scoundrel and a coward, that he had implored Maurice to intercede, first for all Lutheran Germany, then for John Frederick and himself, and finally for himself alone. "See what these men are," added the bishop later. "Philip has even offered to march against the Duke of Saxony. He is a sorry fellow and of evil nature. He is such a scoundrel that his majesty cannot trust him in any promise that he may make, for he has never kept one yet." The imperial minister's judgment upon the Landgrave was too severe. He long struggled for honor against fear, and but for his son-in-law, Maurice's influence might have made a better fight. Maurice had from the first striven to detach Philip from John Frederick, while he in turn was expected by the Landgrave to strike in for a free Germany and a free gospel against the Hungarian hussars and the black Spanish devils. When the two Lutheran leaders parted in November 1546 on no good terms, Philip warned his son-in-law that the elector was on the march against him, but begged to intercede with Charles for a general peace. Maurice would have no peace with his Ernestine cousins, but offered to use all his influence on behalf of Philip, who must hasten to decide, for Buren was on his legs, and the emperor was an obstinate man. From this moment the Landgrave's irresolution was piteous. The negotiations crippled all enterprise, and yet he could not persuade himself to abandon his ally, although the natural expiry of the League of Smalcald on February 27, 1547, gave him a tolerable pretext. Maurice waxed impatient at the recurring hesitation, at the perpetual amendment of all suggested terms. Philip could not bargain with Charles as though he were a tradesman. He need have no fear for religion, but he must make it clear to the emperor and Ferdinand that he was against John Frederick. Then came the defeat of Muhlberg, which at least relieved Philip from his obligations to his late ally. It was now the surrender of his fortresses and his artillery that he could not stomach, and the victory of Drakenberg raised his once martial ardor to a final flicker. The flicker died away, and at length Philip yielded to the pressure of Maurice and Joachim of Brandenburg. Charles insisted on unconditional surrender, but promised the mediators that punishment should not extend to personal injury or perpetual imprisonment. This only, however, on their pledge that Philip should not be informed of these limitations. It was agreed that he should dismantle his fortresses, with one exception, surrender his artillery, and pay an indemnity, but that his territory should remain intact and its religion undisturbed. With Philip's surrender, the war seemed virtually at an end. Magdeburg, indeed, still held out, for fear of falling again under its Catholic Hohenzollern archbishop. There was no reason to believe that the city would prove more courageous than its fellows. Charles did not dare spend his 4,000 Spaniards in the assault, but in this case extravagance would have proved to be economy. When he knew his subject, his opinion was usually well-founded. He had little knowledge, however, of North Germany, and confused Magdeburg with Ulm or Augsburg. It were better for Charles had his Spaniards been decimated on its parapet than that they should lord it in security over the churches and taverns of southern Germany. Apart from his two last mistakes, in the campaign against the League, Charles, whether as soldier or statesman, is seen at his best. When once the drums beat to arms, there was an end to irresolution. He had that reserve of energy upon which an indolent, lethargic nature can sometimes at a crisis draw. The Netherlands seemed threatened from east to west, yet in perfect calm he ordered his agitated sister Mary to watch her frontiers, but to send every man and gun that could be spared under Buren to the front. Taking advantage of his enemy's delays, he made with greatly inferior forces the forward move on Ingolstadt, and was there seen under heavy fire, steady as a rock, and smiling. Racked by gout, he now sought sleep in his litter behind a bastion, now warmed his aching limbs in a little movable wooden room heated by a stove. In the cold, wet November, when generals and ministers fell sick, and soldiers of every nationality deserted, he resolutely rejected expert advice to withdraw into winter quarters. He would not give his enemies, he said, the least chance of outstaying him. All success, wrote the Marquis of Marignano, was due to the emperor's resolution to keep the field. Charles vexed the fiery Buren by shrinking from a general engagement because he knew that his combinations would break up the League without the risk of a battle. But when once danger really pressed, ill as he was, he marched across Germany and followed fast upon the Elector's heels until he tripped and took him.
End of section 30.
Section 31 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avahi in April 2022. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Section 31. Introduction of Christianity into Japan, A.D. 1549, by John H. Gubbins. Lands discovered or settled by Europeans after the founding of the Jesuits were quickly chosen by the zealous members of that order as scenes of missionary work. In the case of Japan, missions followed discovery with unusual rapidity. Excepting what was told by Marco Polo, who visited the coast of Japan in the 13th century, nothing was learned of that country by the Western world until its discovery by the Portuguese. In 1541, King John III requested Francis Xavier, one of the Jesuit founders, with other members of his order, to undertake missionary work in the Portuguese colonies. Through his labors in India, Xavier became known as the Apostle of the Indies. Before sailing to Japan, he had established a flourishing mission with a school, called the Seminary of the Holy Faith, at Goa, on the Malabar coast of India. It was to Portuguese enterprise that Christianity owed its introduction into Japan in the 16th century. As early as 1542, Portuguese trading vessels began to visit Japan, where they exchanged Western commodities for the then little-known products of the Japanese islands, and 7 years afterwards 3 Portuguese missionaries, Xavier, Torres, and Fernandez, took passage in one of these merchant ships and landed at Kagoshima. The leading spirit of the 3, it need scarcely be said, was Xavier, who had already acquired considerable reputation by his missionary labors in India. After a short residence, the missionaries were forced to leave Satsuma, and after as short a stay in the island of Hirado, which appears to have been then the rendezvous of trade between the Portuguese merchants and the Japanese, they crossed over to the mainland and settled down in Yamaguchi in Nagato, the chief town of the territories of the Prince of Choshu. After a visit to the capital, which was productive of no result, owing to the disturbed state of the country, Xavier, November 1551, left Japan with the intention of founding a Jesuit mission in China, but died on his way in the island of Sanxian. In 1553, fresh missionaries arrived, some of whom remained in Bungo, where Xavier had made a favorable impression before his departure, while others joined their fellow missionaries in Yamaguchi. After having been driven from the latter place by the outbreak of disturbances, and having failed to establish a footing in Hizen, we find the missionaries in 1557 collected in Bungo, and this province appears to have become their headquarters from that time. In the course of the next year but one, Villela made a visit to Kyoto, Sakai, and other places, during which he is said to have gained a convert in the person of the daimyo of the small principality of Omura, who displayed an imprudent excess of religious zeal in the destruction of idols and other extreme measures, which could only tend to provoke the hostility of the Buddhist priesthood. The conversion of this prince was followed by that of Arima no Kami, mistakenly called the Prince of Arima by the Jesuits. Other missionaries arriving in 1560, the circle of operations was extended, but shortly afterward the revolution, headed by Mori, compelled Villela to leave Kyoto where he had settled, and a simultaneous outbreak in Omura necessitated the withdrawal of the missionaries stationed there. Mori of Choshiu was perhaps the most powerful noble of the day, possessing no fewer than 10 provinces, and, as he was throughout an open enemy to Christianity, his influence was exercised against it with much ill result. On Villella's return to Kyoto from Sakai, where a branch mission had been established, he succeeded in gaining several distinguished converts. Among these were Takayama, a leading general of the time, and his nephew. He did not, however, remain long in the capital. The recurrence of troubles in 1568 made it necessary for him to withdraw, and he then proceeded to Nagasaki, where he met with considerable success. In this same year we come across Valegnani preaching in the Goto Isles, and Torres in the island of Seki, where he died. Almeida, too, about this time founded a Christian community at Shimabara, afterwards notorious as the scene of the revolt and massacre of the Christians. Hitherto we find little mention of Christianity in Japanese books. This may partly be explained by the fact that the labors of the missionaries were chiefly confined to the southern provinces, Christianity having as yet made little progress at Kyoto, the seat of literature. But the scarcity of Japanese records can scarcely be wondered at in the face of the edict issued later in the next century, which interdicted not only books on the subject of Christianity, but any book in which even the name of Christian or the word foreign should be mentioned. Short notices occur in several native works of the arrival in Kyoto at this date of the Jesuit missionary Orgatin, and some curious details are furnished respecting the progress of Christianity in the capital and the attitude of Nobunaga in regard to it. The Saikoko Kirishitan Bataren Jitsuroku, or True Record of Christian Padres in Kyushu, gives a minute account of the appearance and dress of Orgatin, and goes on to say, "He was asked his name and why he had come to Japan, and replied that he was the Padre Orgatin and had come to spread his religion. He was told that he could not be allowed at once to preach his religion, but would be informed later on. Nobunaga accordingly took counsel with his retainers as to whether he should allow Christianity to be preached or not. One of these strongly advised him not to do so, on the ground that there were already enough religions in the country. But Nobunaga replied that Buddhism had been introduced from abroad and had done good in the country, and he therefore did not see why Christianity should not be granted a trial. Orgatin was consequently allowed to erect a church and to send for others of his order, who, when they came, were found to be like him in appearance. Their plan of action was to tend the sick and relieve the poor, and so prepare the way for the reception of Christianity, and then to convert everyone and make the 66 provinces of Japan subject to Portugal. The Ibuki Mogusa gives further details of the subject and says that the Jesuits called their church Yierokuji after the name of the period in which it was built, but that Nobunaga changed the name to Nambanji, or Temple of the Southern Savages. The word Namban was the term usually applied to the Portuguese and Spaniards. During the next 10 years, Orgatin and other missionaries worked with considerable success in Kyoto under Nobunaga's immediate protection. This period is also remarkable for the conversion of the Prince of Bungo, who made open profession of Christianity and retired into private life, and for the rapid progress which the new doctrine made among the subjects of Arima no Kami. This good fortune was again counterbalanced by the course of events in the Goto Islands, where Christianity lost much ground owing to a change of rulers. 10 years thus passed away, when the Christian communities sustained great loss in the disgrace of Takayama, who was banished to Kaga for taking part in an unsuccessful intrigue against Nobunaga, which was headed by the Prince of Choshiu. Takayama's nephew, Ukon, however, declared for Nobunaga, and the latter gave a further proof of his friendly feeling toward Christianity by establishing a church in Atsuchi no Shiro, the castle town which he had built for himself in his native province of Omi. In 1582 a mission was sent to the Papal See on the part of the Princes of Bungo and Omura and Arima no Kami. This mission was accompanied by Valegnani and reached Rome in 1585, returning 5 years later to Japan. In the following year Nobunaga was assassinated, and Hideyoshi, who succeeded him in the chief power, was content, for the first 3 or 4 years of his administration, to follow in the line of policy marked out by his predecessor. Christianity, therefore, progressed in spite of the drawbacks caused by the frequent feuds between the southern daimyos, and seminaries were established under Hideyoshi's auspices at Osaka and Sakai. During this period, Martinez arrived in the capacity of bishop. He was charged with costly presents from the Viceroy of Goa to Hideyoshi and received a favorable audience. Hideyoshi's attitude toward Christianity at this time is easily explained. The powerful southern barons were not willing to accept him as Nobunaga's successor without a struggle, and there were other reasons against the adoption of too hasty measures. 2 of his generals, Kondera and Konishi Setsunokami, who afterward commanded the 2nd Division of the army sent against Korea, the governor of Osaka, and numerous other officers of state and nobles of rank and influence, had embraced Christianity, and the Christians were therefore not without influential supporters. Hideyoshi's first act was to secure his position. For this purpose he marched into Kyushu at the head of a large force and was everywhere victorious. This done, he threw off the mask he had been wearing up to this time, and in 1587 took the first step in his new course of action by ordering the destruction of the Christian church at Kyoto, which had been in existence for a period of 18 years, and the expulsion of the missionaries from the capital. It will be seen by the following extract from the Ibuki Mogusa that Nobunaga at one time entertained designs for the destruction of Nambanji. Nobunaga, we read, now began to regret his previous policy in permitting the introduction of Christianity. He accordingly assembled his retainers and said to them, "The conduct of these missionaries in persuading people to join them by giving money does not please me. It must be, I think, that they harbor the design of seizing the country. How would it be, think you, if we were to demolish Nambanji?" To this, Maeda Tokuzinin replied, "It is now too late to demolish the temple of Nambanji. To endeavor to arrest the power of this religion now is like trying to arrest the current of the ocean. Nobles both great and small have become adherents of it. If you would exterminate this religion now, there is fear lest disturbances be created even among your own retainers. I am, therefore, of opinion that you should abandon your intention of destroying Nambanji. Nobunaga in consequence regretted exceedingly his previous action with regard to the Christian religion, and set about thinking how he could root it out. The Jesuit writers attribute Hideyoshi's sudden change of attitude to 3 different causes, but it is clear that Hideyoshi was never favorable to Christianity, and that he only waited for his power to be secure before taking decided measures of hostility. His real feeling in regarding to the Christians and their teachers is explained in the Life of Hideyoshi, from which work we learn that even before his accession to power, he had ventured to remonstrate with Nobunaga for his policy toward Christianity. Hideyoshi's next act was to banish Takayama Ukon to Kaga, where his uncle already was, and he then, in 1588, issued a decree ordering the missionaries to assemble at Hirado and prepare to leave Japan. They did so, but finding that measures were not pushed to extremity, they dispersed and placed themselves under the protection of various nobles who had embraced Christianity. The territories of these princes offered safe asylums, and in these scattered districts the work of Christianity progressed secretly, while openly interdicted. In 1591, Valegnani had a favorable audience of Hideyoshi, but he was received entirely in an official capacity, namely in the character of envoy of the Viceroy of Goa. Christianity was at its most flourishing stage during the first few years of Hideyoshi's administration. We can discern the existence at this date of a strong Christian party in the country, though the turning point had been reached and the tide of progress was on the ebb. It is to this influence probably, coupled with the fact that his many warlike expeditions left him little leisure to devote to religious questions, that we must attribute the slight relaxation observable in his policy toward Christianity at this time. Up to this date, says Charlevoix, Hideyoshi had not evinced any special bitterness against Christianity, and had not proceeded to rigorous measures in regard to Christians. The condition of Christianity was reassuring. Rodriguez was well in favor at court, and Organtin had returned to Kyoto along with several other missionaries, and found means to render as much assistance to the Christians in that part of the country as he had been able to do before the issue of the edict against Christianity by Hideyoshi. The inference, which it is intended should be drawn from these remarks, taken with the context, is clear, namely that, had the Jesuits been left alone to prosecute the work of evangelizing Japan, the ultimate result might have been very different. However, this was not to be. Hitherto, for a period of 44 years, the Jesuits had it all their own way in Japan. Latterly, by virtue of a bull issued by Pope Gregory VIII in 1585, the date of the appointment of the first bishop and of the arrival at Rome of the Japanese mission, and subsequently confirmed by the bull of Clement III in 1600, by which the religieux of other orders were excluded from missionary work in Japan. The object of these papal decrees was, it seems, to ensure the propagation of Christianity on a uniform system. They were, however, disregarded when the time came, and therefore, for a new influence which was brought to bear upon Christianity at this date, not altogether for its good, if the Jesuit accounts may be credited, we must look to the arrival of an embassy from the governor of the Philippines, whose ambassador was accompanied by 4 Franciscan priests. These new arrivals, when confronted by the Jesuits with the papal bull, declared that they had not transgressed it, and defended their action on the ground that they had come attached to an embassy and not in the character of missionaries. But they argued at the same time, with a casuistry only equaled by their opponents, that, having once arrived in Japan, there was nothing to hinder them from exercising their calling as preachers of Christianity. The embassy was successful, and Baptiste, who appears to have conducted the negotiations in place of the real envoy, obtained Hideyoshi's consent to his shrewd proposal that, pending the reference to Manila of Hideyoshi's claim to the sovereignty of the Philippines, he and his brother missionaries should remain as hostages. Hideyoshi, while consenting, made their residence conditional on their not preaching Christianity, a condition which it is needless to say was never observed. Thus, at one and the same time, the Spaniards, who had long been watching with their jealous eyes the exclusive right of trade enjoyed by the Portuguese, obtained an opening for commerce, and the Franciscans a footing for their religious mission. It was not long before the newly arrived missionaries were called upon to prove their devotion to their cause. In 1593, in consequence of the indiscreet statements of the pilot of a Spanish galleon, which, being driven by stress of weather into a port of Tosa, was seized by Hideyoshi, 9 missionaries, namely 6 Franciscans and 3 Jesuits, were arrested in Kyoto and Osaka, and, having been taken to Nagasaki, were there burned. This was the first execution carried out by the government. Hideyoshi died in the following year, 1594, and the civil troubles which preceded the succession of Ieyasu to the post of administrator, in which the Christians lost their chief supporter, Konishi, who took part against Ieyasu, favored the progress of Christianity insofar as diverting attention from it to matters of more pressing moment. Ieyasu's policy toward Christianity was a repetition of his predecessors. Occupied entirely with military campaigns against those who refused to acknowledge his supremacy, he permitted the Jesuits, who now numbered 100, to establish themselves in force at Kyoto, Osaka, and Nagasaki. But as soon as tranquillity was restored, and he felt himself secure in the seat of power, he at once gave proof of the policy he intended to follow by the issue of a decree of expulsion against the missionaries. This was in 1600. The Jesuit writers affirm that he was induced to withdraw his edict in consequence of the threatening attitude adopted by certain Christian nobles who had espoused his cause in the late Civil War, but no mention is made of this in the Japanese accounts. So varying, and indeed so altogether unintelligible, was the action of the different nobles throughout Kyushu in regard to Christianity during the next few years, that we see one who was not a Christian offering an asylum in his dominions to several hundred native converts who were expelled from a neighboring province, another who had systematically opposed the introduction of Christianity, actually sending a mission to the Philippines to ask for missionaries, while a third, who had hitherto made himself conspicuous by his almost fanatical zeal in the Christian cause, suddenly abandoned his new faith, and, from having been one of its most ardent supporters, became one of its most bitter foes. The year 1602 is remarkable for the dispatch of an embassy by Ieyasu to the Philippines, and for the large number of religieux of all orders who flocked to Japan. Affairs remained in statu quo for the next 2 or 3 years, during which the Christian cause was weakened by the death of 2 men which it could ill afford to lose. One of these was the noble called Condera by Charlevoix, but whose name we have been unable to trace in Japanese records. The other was Organtin, who had deservedly the reputation of being the most energetic member of the Jesuit body. The number of Christians in Japan at this time is stated to have been 1,800,000. The number of missionaries was of course proportionally large, and was increased by the issue in 1608 of a new bull by Pope Paul V, allowing to religieux of all orders free access to Japan. The year 1610 is remarkable for the arrival of the Dutch, who settled in Hirado, and for the destruction in the harbor of Nagasaki of the annual Portuguese galleon sent by the traders of Macao. In this later affair, which rose out of a dispute between the natives and the people of the ship, Arima no Kami was concerned, and his alliance with the missionaries was thus terminated. In 1611, no less than 3 embassies arrived in Japan from the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese respectively, and in 1613 Ceres succeeded in founding an English factory in Hirado, where the Dutch had already established themselves. It was early in the following year that Christianity was finally proscribed by Ieyasu. The decree of expulsion directed against the missionaries was followed by a fierce outbreak of persecution in all the provinces in which Christians were to be found, which was conducted with systematic and relentless severity. The Jesuit accounts attribute this resolution on the part of Ieyasu to the intrigues of the English and Dutch traders. 2 stories, by one of which it was sought to fix the blame on the former, and by the other on the latter, were circulated, and will be found at length in Charlevoix's history. We have no wish to enter upon a defense either of our countrymen or of the Dutch, and fully admit the possibility of such intrigues having occurred. Indeed, considering in what relations both Spanish and Portuguese stood at that time to both of the other nations, and how high religious feeling ran in the 17th century, it would be strange if some intrigue had not taken place. Still, we should like to point out that there were, we think, causes other than those to which the Jesuit writers confined themselves, quite sufficient in themselves to account for the extreme measures taken against Christianity at this date. There was the predetermination against Christianity already shown by Ieyasu. There were the new avenues of trade opened up by the arrival of the English and Dutch. There was the increased activity displayed by the missionaries at a time when Christianity was in a weak state, and lastly there was the influence of the Buddhist priesthood. That this edict of expulsion issued by Ieyasu was the effect of no sudden caprice on his part is clear from the general view which we have of his whole policy, which was similar to that of his predecessor. His early tolerance of Christianity is susceptible of the same explanation as that shown by Hideyoshi. His mind was evidently made up, and he was only biding his time. It is also highly probable that the new facilities for trade offered by the advent of the Dutch and English may have had some influence upon the action of Ieyasu. It is impossible that he can have been altogether blind to the fact that the teaching of Christianity had not been unattended with certain evils, dangerous, to say the least, to the tranquillity of the country, and it cannot have escaped his notice that, whereas the respective admissions of Portuguese and Spaniards had been followed by the introduction of Christian missionaries, who in numbers far exceeded the traders, the same feature was not a part of the policy of the 2 other nations, whose proceedings had no connection whatsoever with religion. Possibly, too, reports may have reached his ears of the growing supremacy of the Dutch in the East, and have induced him to transfer his favor from the Portuguese and Spaniards to the new arrivals. As regards the condition of Christianity at this time, the Jesuit accounts supply us with facts which show that, numerically speaking, the Christian cause was never so strong as at this period. There were some 2 millions of converts, whose spiritual concerns were administered by no fewer than 200 missionaries, 3/4 of whom were Jesuits. According to the Kerisuto Ki, a native work, there were Christian churches in every province of Kyushu except Hyuga and Osumi, and also in Kyoto, Osaka, Sendai, and Kanagawa in Kaga, and it was only in 8 provinces of Japan that Christianity had gained no footing. An increased activity in the operations of the missionaries is discernible about this time. The Dominicans in Satsuma, the Franciscans in Yedo, Tokyo, and the Jesuits in the capital and southern provinces seem to have been vying with each other which should gain most converts, and the circuit made by Cerqueira, in which he visited all the Jesuit establishments throughout the country, was probably not without effect in exciting fresh enthusiasm among the converts everywhere, which, again, would naturally draw attention to the progress of Christianity. But, strong as the position of the Christians was numerically, we must not judge of the strength of their cause merely by the number of converts, or by the number of missionaries resident in Japan. If we consider the facts before us, we find that Christianity lacked the best of all strength, influence in the state. All its principal supporters among the aristocracy were either dead, had renounced their new faith, or were in exile, and here we have the real weakness of the Christian cause. While, therefore, circumstances combined to draw attention to its progress, it was in a state which could ill resist any renewed activity of persecution, which might be the result of the increased interest which it excited. Without influence at the court, and without influence in the country, beyond what slight influence the mass of common people scattered through various provinces, who were Christians, might be said to possess, Christianity presented itself assailable with impunity. The last cause we have mentioned, as being probably connected with the decisive measures adopted by Ieyasu, is the influence of the Buddhist priesthood. Japanese history mentions the great power attained by the priesthood prior to Nobunaga's administration. Although that power was broken by Nobunaga, Hideyoshi did not inherit the former's animosity toward the priests, and Ieyasu from the first came forward as their patron. And again, we must not lose sight of the fact that a deep-rooted suspicion of foreigners was ever present in the minds of the Japanese government, a suspicion which the course of events in China, of which we may presume the Japanese were not altogether ignorant, the jealousy of the native priests, the control of their converts exercised by the missionaries, which doubtless extended to secular matters, the connection of Christianity with trade, and the astounding progress made by it in the space of half a century, all tended to confirm. Enough has been said to show that we need not go so far as the intrigues, real or imaginary, of the English and Dutch, to look for causes of the renewed stimulus given at this date to the measures against Christianity. In 1614 the edict was carried into effect, and the missionaries, accompanied by the Japanese princes who had been in exile in Kaga, and a number of native Christians, were made to embark from Nagasaki. Several missionaries remained concealed in the country, and in subsequent years not a few contrived to elude the vigilance of the authorities and to re-enter Japan. But they were all detected sooner or later, and suffered for their temerity by their deaths. Persecution did not stop with the expulsion of the missionaries, nor at the death of Ieyasu was any respite given to the native Christians. And this brings us to the closing scene of this history, the tragedy of Shimabara. In the autumn of 1637, the peasantry of a convert district in Hizen, driven past endurance by the fierce ferocity of the persecution, assembled to the number of 30,000, and, fortifying the castle of Shimabara, declared open defiance to the government. Their opposition was soon overborne, troops were sent against them, and after a short but desperate resistance, all the Christians were put to the sword. With the rising of Shimabara and its sanguinary suppression by the government, the curtain falls on the early history of Christianity in Japan. End of section 31.
Section 32 of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Collapse of the power of Charles V. France, seizes German bishoprics. A.D. 1552. By Lady C. C. Jackson. Editor's Introduction. Henry II, son of Francis I, ascended the throne of France in 1547. It had been the ambition of the French to establish the eastern boundary of their country on the Rhine, and thence along the summit of the Alps to the Mediterranean Sea. Jealousy of the growing power of his father's old enemy, the Emperor Charles V, probably added to the French king's eagerness to fulfill the desire of his people for extension of their borders. Charles was now occupied with the religious wars in Germany, and Henry prepared to improve his opportunity by taking full advantage of the emperor's situation. The fact that the Protestants among his own subjects were cruelly persecuted did not deter the French monarch from furthering his ambition by consenting to assist the German Protestants against their own sovereign. In 1551, when for 6 years there had been no actual war between France and the Empire, Henry entered into an alliance with German princes against the emperor. Several of those princes, headed by Maurice of Saxony, had secretly formed a league to resist by force of arms the measures employed by Charles to reduce Germany to insupportable and perpetual servitude. End of editor's introduction. Charles V was on the point of becoming as despotic in Germany as he was in Spain. The long interval of peace, though not very profound, war being always threatened, and attempts to provoke it frequent, yet was sufficiently so to enable him to devote himself to his favorite scheme of humbling the princes and free states of the empire. He had sown dissension among them, succeeded in breaking up the League of Smalcald, and detained in prison, threatened with perpetual captivity, the Landgrave of Hesse and the Elector John Frederick of Saxony. They had been sentenced to death, having taken up arms against him. Frequently appealed to release them, Charles declared that to trouble him further on their account would be to bring on them the execution of the sentence they so richly merited. His political aims he believed to be now accomplished, and the spirit of German independence nearly if not wholly extinguished. But with this he was not content. The time had arrived, he thought, for the full and final extirpation of heresy, and the carrying out of his grand scheme of establishing uniformity of religion in the empire. The formula of faith, called the interim, which he had drawn up for general observance until the council reassembled, had been for the sake of peace accepted with slight resistance, except at Magdeburg, which, for its obstinate rejection of it, was placed under the ban of the empire. But the prelates were assembling at Trent, and the full acquiescence of all parties in their decisions, given of course in conformity with the views of Charles V, was to be made imperative. Henry II had already renewed his French alliance with Sultan Suleiman, and was urged to send his lieutenants to ravage the coast of Sicily, a suggestion he was not at all loath to follow. Yet the proposal of an alliance with the heretic German princes, though the league was not simply a Protestant one, met with strenuous opposition from that excellent Catholic Anne de Montmorency. The persecuting king, too, anxious as he was to oppose his arms to those of the emperor, feared to do so in alliance with heretics, lest he should compromise his soul's salvation. But the princes had offered him an irresistible bribe. They proposed, even declared they thought it right, that the seigneur king should take possession of those imperial cities which were not Germanic in language, as Metz, Cambrai, Toul, Verdun, and similar ones, and retain them in quality of vicar of the Holy Empire. As a further inducement, they promised, having accomplished their own objects, to aid him with their troops to recover from Charles his heritage of Milan. This was decisive. On October 5th, a pact was signed with France by the Lutheran Elector Maurice, in his own name and that of the Confederate princes, Henry's ambassador being the Catholic Bishop of Bayonne. Extensive preparations for war were immediately set on foot and new taxes levied, for the king had promised aid in money also, a considerable sum monthly as long as hostilities continued. He, however, deemed it expedient, before joining his army, to give some striking proof of his continued orthodoxy. First, by way of counterbalancing his heretical alliance with the Lutherans, and his infidel one with the Mussulmans. Next, to destroy the false hopes founded on them by French reformers. The heretics, during his absence, were therefore to be hunted down with the utmost rigor. The Sorbonne was charged to examine minutely all books from Geneva, and no unlettered person was permitted to discuss matters of faith. All cities and municipalities were strictly enjoined to elect none but good Catholics to the office of mayor or sheriff, exacting from them a certificate of Catholicism before entering on the duties of their office. Neglect of this would subject the electors themselves to the pains and penalties inflicted on heretics. A Grand Inquisitor was appointed to take care of the faith in Lyons, and the daily burnings on the Place de Grève went on simultaneously with the preparations in the arsenals, and no less vigorously. Thus the king was enabled to enter on this war with a safe conscience. Montmorency, unwilling always to oppose the emperor, was compelled, lest he should seem less patriotic than his rivals, to add his voice also in favor of the project that promised the realization of the views of Charles VII and Francis I, that the natural boundary of France was the Rhine. To return to Germany and the emperor, whose complicated affairs are so entangled with those of France that they cannot be wholly separated, each in some measure forming the complement of the other. The command-in-chief of the German army was given to Maurice of Saxony, an able general, full of resource, daring and dauntless in the field, crafty and cautious in the cabinet as Charles himself. Throughout the winter he secretly assembled troops, preparing to take the field early in the spring, yet adroitly concealing his projects, and lulling into security the most artful monarch in Europe. The emperor had left Augsburg for Innsbruck, that he might at the same time watch over the council and the affairs of Germany and Italy. He was suffering from asthma, gout, and other maladies, chiefly brought on by his excesses at table, and rendered incurable by his inability to put any restraint on his immoderate appetite. In his retreat, some rumors had reached him that the movements of Maurice of Saxony were suspicious, and that he was raising troops in Transylvania. But he gave little heed to this, or to warnings pressed on him by some of his partisans. For Maurice, to serve his own ambitious views, had in fact, though professing the Reformed faith, aided Charles to acquire that power and ascendancy, that almost unlimited despotism in Germany he now proposed to overthrow. For his services he had obtained the larger part of the electoral dominions of his unfortunate relative, John Frederick of Saxony, whose release, as also that of the Landgrave, now formed part of his program for delivering Germany from her fetters ere the imperial despot could, as Maurice saw he was prepared to do, rivet them on her. To renew the Protestant League, to place himself at its head and defy the despot, was more congenial to Maurice's restless, aspiring mind than to play the part of his lieutenant. The winter passed away without any serious suspicions on Charles's part. To throw him off his guard, Maurice had undertaken to subdue the Magdeburgers. The leniency of his conduct toward those rebels, with whom he was secretly in league, did at last excite a doubt in Charles's mind. Maurice was summoned to Innsbruck, ostensibly to confer with him respecting the liberation of his father-in-law, the Landgrave of Hesse. But Maurice was far too wary to put himself in his power, and readily found some plausible excuse to delay his journey from time to time. But when, early in March, at the head of 25,000 men thoroughly equipped, he announced that he was about to set out on his journey, the information was accompanied with a declaration of war. It was a war, he said, for the defense of the true religion, its ministers and preachers, for the deliverance of prisoners detained against all faith and justice, to free Germany from her wretched condition, and to oppose the emperor's completion of that absolute monarchy toward which he had so long been aiming. To this manifesto was appended another from the King of France. Therein Henry announced himself the defender of the liberties of Germany and protector of her captive princes, further stating that, broken-hearted, le cœur navré, at the condition of Germany, he could not refuse to aid her, but had determined to do so to the utmost power of his ability, even to personally engaging in this war undertaken for liberty and not for his personal benefit. This document, written in French, was headed by the representation of a cap between two poniards, and around it the inscription, "The Emblem of Liberty." It is said to have been copied from some ancient coins, and to have been appropriated as the symbol of freedom by Caesar's assassins. Thus singularly was brought to light by a king of the French Renaissance that terrible cap of liberty, before which the ancient crown of France was one day destined to fall. The declaration of the German princes and that of their ally the King of France fell like a thunderbolt on the emperor. So great was his astonishment and consternation at the events so unexpected. With rapid marches, Maurice advanced on Upper Germany, while other divisions of the army, headed by the Confederate princes, hastened on toward Tyrol by way of Franconia and Swabia, everywhere being received with open arms as Germany's liberators. Maurice reached Augsburg on April 1st, and took possession of that important city, the garrison offering no resistance, and the inhabitants receiving him joyfully. There, as in other towns on his march which had willingly opened their gates to him, the interim was abolished, the churches restored to the Protestants, the magistrates appointed by the emperor displaced, and those he had rejected reinstated. Money, too, was freely offered him, and the deficiency in his artillery supplied. At Trent, the news that the Protestant princes, joined by several of the Catholics and Free States, had taken up arms for liberty, caused a terrible panic. The fathers of the council, Italian, Spanish, and German, at once made a precipitate retreat, and this famous council, without authority from pope or emperor, dissolved itself, to reassemble only after even a longer interval than before. When Maurice began his march, Henry II had joined his army at Chalons, and was on his way to Lorraine. Toul, on his approach, presented the keys of the city to the constable commanding the vanguard, the king afterward making his entry, and receiving the oath of fidelity from the inhabitants, having previously sworn to maintain their rights and privileges inviolate. After this easy conquest, the French army continued its march toward Metz. This old free republican city did not so readily as Toul yield to the French. The municipal authorities very politely offered provisions to the army, but declined to deliver the keys of the city to the constable. They were, however, willing to admit the king and the princes who accompanied him within their walls. Troops were not permitted to enter Metz, whatever their nation. This was one of their privileges. Montmorency cared little for privileges, and violence would probably have been used but that the Bishop of Metz, who was a Frenchman, prevailed on the principal burgesses to allow the constable to enter with an escort of 2 ensigns, each with his company of infantry. Montmorency availed himself of this permission to give his ensigns 1,500 of his best troops. The city gates were thrown open, and the burgesses then perceived their error, but too late to remedy it. They were firmly repulsed when attempting to exclude the unwelcome visitors. There was, however, no bloodshed. The people were soon reconciled to the change, and the chief sheriff and town council on the king's entry having assembled on the cathedral porch, Henry, there, in the presence of an anxious multitude who crowded around him to hear him, made oath strictly to maintain their franchises and immunities. Thus easily was captured the former capital of the ancient Austrian kings, which remained under the dominion of France until separated from her by the misfortunes of the Second Empire. The city of Verdun followed the example of Toul, so that Henry's defense of the liberties of Germany was thus far nothing more than a military promenade, with grand public entries, banquets, and general festivity. The inhabitants of Metz, like the rest of his conquests French in language and manners, petitioned the king not to restore their city to the empire, of which it had been a vassal republic from the beginning of the feudal era. They feared the emperor's revenge. Henry, however, had no thought of relinquishing Metz. He was too well pleased with his new possession, and proposed to make it one of the ramparts of France. But while Henry, for the defense of German independence, was making conquests and annexing them to his dominions, Charles V had fled before Maurice's vigorous pursuit, and had only escaped capture by a mere mischance that briefly retarded his pursuer's progress. When Augsburg was taken, Charles felt that he was not safe at Innsbruck. He was neither in a position to crush the rebellious princes, nor to resist the invasion of the King of France. Want of means had induced him to disband a large part of his army. Mexico and Peru for some time had failed to make any remittances to his treasury. The bankers of Venice and Genoa were not willing to lend him money, and it was only by placing Piombino in the hands of Cosimo de' Medici that he obtained from him the small sum of 200,000 crowns. His first impulse was to endeavor to pass over the route of the Netherlands by the valleys of the Inn and the Rhine, but as he could only move owing to his gout from place to place in a litter, he was compelled from physical suffering after proceeding a very short distance on his journey to return to Innsbruck. There he remained with a small body of soldiers sufficient to guard himself personally, having sent all he could possibly spare to hold the mountain pass leading to the almost inaccessible castle of Ehrenberg. But, guided by a shepherd, the heights of Ehrenberg were reached by the troops under George of Brandenburg, after infinite fatigue and danger. The walls were scaled, and the garrison, terrified by the appearance of this unlooked-for enemy, threw down their arms and surrendered. A few hours only separated Innsbruck from Ehrenberg, and Maurice proposed to push on rapidly so as to anticipate the arrival there of any accounts of the loss of the castle, hoping to surprise the emperor and his attendants in an open, defenseless town, and there to dictate conditions of peace. The dissatisfaction of a portion of the troops at not immediately receiving the usual gratuity for taking a place by assault occasioned a short delay in the advance of Maurice's army. He arrived at Innsbruck in the middle of the night, and learned that the emperor had fled only 2 hours before to Carinthia, followed by his ministers and attendants, on foot, on horses, in litters, as they could, but in the greatest hurry and confusion. The night was stormy. Rain was falling in torrents, when the modern Charlemagne, unable to move, was borne in a litter by the light of torches across steep mountain paths with a swiftness most surprising, terror adding wings to the footsteps of his bearers, lest they and their gouty burden should fall into the hands of the heretic army said to be in pursuit. But pursuit was soon given up, for the troops were worn and weary with forced marches and climbing the heights of Ehrenberg. They needed rest, and there was the imperial palace of Innsbruck to pillage, Maurice having given it up to them. Negotiations for peace were opened on May 20th at Passau on the Danube. The King of France was informed of this, it being found necessary to put some check on his proceedings, to remind him that he was the defender of the liberties of Germany, not Germany's oppressor. He and his army had advanced into Alsace, and Montmorency had assured him that it would be as easy to enter Strasbourg and other cities of the Rhine as to penetrate butter. However, when they knocked at the gates of Strasbourg and courteously requested that the Venetian, Florentine, and other ambassadors might be permitted to enter and admire the beautiful city, they found the Strasburgers insensible to these amenities. Butter by no means easily melted, for not only they refused to gratify the soi-disant ambassadors with a sight of their fine city, but mounted and pointed their cannon, as a hint to their visitors that they would do well to withdraw. Henry, perceiving that he would be unable in the present campaign to extend his dominions to the banks of the Rhine, contented himself, before turning his back on it, with the fact that the horses of his army had drunk of the waters of that stream. The Austrasian expedition was less brilliant in its results than he had expected. Nevertheless, whether he was to be included in the peace then negotiating or not, he resolved to retain the 3 bishoprics, Toul, Metz, and Verdun. Meanwhile, the conference of Passau, between Maurice with his princes of the League on the one part, Ferdinand, king of the Romans, and the emperor's plenipotentiaries on the other, proceeded less rapidly than Maurice desired. By prolonging the negotiation, Charles hoped to gain time to assemble an army, when the Catholic princes might rally around him. But even those who had joined the League were exceedingly lukewarm toward their emperor. His despotism they considered being as dangerous to them as to the Protestants. Even his brother Ferdinand, who was on such excellent terms with Maurice that it would almost seem that he had connived at an enterprise he could not openly join in, is said to have seen with satisfaction the check put on Charles by the dauntless leader of the League. But Maurice's propositions being at first rejected, and no counter ones proposed, he at once set off for his army to renew hostilities, as though the negotiations were closed. Charles doubtless renounced the realization of the dream of his life with a pang of despair. That it should vanish at the very moment when he looked for its fulfillment was anguish to him. But pressed by Ferdinand, convinced too that resistance is useless, Charles yields an unwilling assent to the demands of the princes, and the treaty of public peace is signed on August 2nd. Henceforth, the 2 religions are to be on a footing of equality in the empire. Germany divided between Luther and the Pope, who are to live side by side in peace, neither interrupting the other. The ban of the empire to be withdrawn from all persons and places, the captive princes, detained for 5 years in prison if not in fetters, released, while many other matters relating to imperial encroachments are to be satisfactorily settled within 6 months. The defender of German liberty was not included in this treaty. As he proposed to keep the cities he was to occupy but as vicar of the empire, he would have to fight a battle for them with Charles himself. Though compelled to renounce absolute sway over Germany, he yet thought it incumbent on him to re-establish the territory of the empire in its full integrity. His valiant sister, the Dowager Queen of Hungary, who governed the Netherlands so ably for him, was diligently collecting an army for the destitute monarch of many kingdoms, and troops were on their way from Spain. In spite of his infirmities, Charles was in such haste to chastise the French and revenge himself on Henry, having succeeded in raising an army 60,000 strong, besides 7,000 pioneers, that he rejected the prudent counsels of his generals, who begged him to wait until the spring, when Metz might be attacked with much greater advantage. But his excessive obstinacy, which had led to so many of his disasters, again prevailed. The Duc de Guise, now governor of Metz, had put the citadel into a state of defence. The garrison was numerous, and, as was usual wherever he commanded, thither followed all the young, ardent spirits among the great families of France. The siege of Metz was a terrible disaster for the emperor. The extreme severity of the winter, a scant supply of clothing and other necessaries, were soon followed by sickness, typhus, and many deaths. Desertions were numerous, for the sufferings of the troops had quenched all war and subverted all discipline. Desperate efforts to take Metz were continued for nearly 3 months without avail, when Charles, thoroughly disheartened, and unable to rise from his couch except for removal to his litter, raised the siege, abandoning the greater part of his artillery, which was half buried in the mud. "Fortune," he exclaimed, "I perceive is indeed a woman. She prefers a young king to an old emperor." The spectacle that met the eyes of the victorious defenders of Metz, on issuing forth in pursuit of the enemy, is said to have been one of so harrowing a nature that even rough soldiers, accustomed to the horrors of war, looked on the misery around them with emotions of deepest pity. There lay the dying and the dead heaped up together. The wounded and those who had been stricken down by fever stretched side by side on the gory, muddy earth. Others had sunk into it, and, unable to extricate themselves, were frozen to their knees, and plaintively asked for death to put an end to their wretchedness. Scattered along the route of the retreat lay dead horses, tents, arms, portions of the baggage, and many sick soldiers who had fallen by the way in their efforts to keep up with the hasty march of the remnant of the army. A sad and terrible scene indeed in a career called one of glory. François de Guise greatly distinguished himself as a general, and added to his military renown by his defence of Metz. But far greater glory attaches to his name for his humane and generous conduct to the suffering, abandoned troops of Charles's army. All whose lives could be saved or sufferings relieved received every care and attention that he and the surgeons of his army could bestow on them. Following his example, instead of the savage brutality with which the victors were then accustomed to treat their fallen foes, kindness and good offices were rendered by all to the poor victims of the emperor's revenge for the loss of Metz. So utterly contrary was such treatment to the practice of the age, that the generosity and humanity of François de Guise toward an enemy's troops passed into a proverb as a courtoisie de Metz. End of section 32. Read by Jeffrey Wilson, Ames, Iowa, 2022.
Section 33 of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles S. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Religious Peace of Augsburg, Abdication of Charles V, A.D. 1555, William Robertson. By the victory of Charles V at Muhlberg in 1547, the emperor obtained a decided advantage over the Smalkaldic League, and seemed to be master of the situation in Germany. He convened a diet at Augsburg, and promulgated an interim or provisional arrangement for peace, but it was imperfectly carried out. Later interims also proving unsatisfactory, various other attempts at settlement were made, and finally, by the Peace of Passau, 1552, religious liberty was granted to the Protestants. Charles now appeared to be at the height of his power, but new danger threatened him from France. The alliance of King Henry II with Maurice of Saxony and other Protestant princes was followed by what is sometimes called the Second Smalkaldic War. Charles was quickly worsted, and only escaped capture by fleeing into Switzerland. In a later attack upon France, he gained but little success. The emperor was now more than ever anxious for peace, and only awaited the meeting of a diet which had been summoned soon after the Treaty of Passau. This meeting was delayed by violent commotions raised in Germany by Albert, Margrave of Brandenburg. It was further delayed by the engrossment in his own affairs of Ferdinand, King of Bohemia and Hungary. He was the brother of Charles, had exerted himself, though with slight success, to settle the religious disputes in Germany, and Charles needed his presence at the diet, whereby he hoped to secure a final pacification. As a diet was now necessary on many accounts, Ferdinand, about the beginning of the year 1555, had repaired to Augsburg. Though few of the princes were present either in person or by their deputies, he opened the assembly by a speech, in which he proposed the termination of the dissensions to which the new tenets and controversies with regard to religion had given rise, not only as the first and great business of the diet, but as the point which both the emperor and he had most at heart. He represented the innumerable obstacles which the emperor had to surmount before he could procure the convocation of a general council, as well as the fatal accidents which had for some time retarded and at last suspended the consultations of that assembly. He observed that experience had already taught them how vain it was to expect any remedy for evils which demanded immediate redress from a general council, the assembling of which would either be prevented or its deliberations be interrupted by the dissensions and hostilities of the princes of Christendom. That a national council in Germany, which, as some imagined, might be called with greater ease and deliberate with more perfect security, was an assembly of an unprecedented nature, the jurisdiction of which was uncertain in its extent, and the form of its proceedings undefined. That in his opinion there remained but one method for composing their happy differences, which, though it had often been tried without success, might yet prove effectual if it were attempted with a better and more pacific spirit than had appeared on former occasions, and that was to choose a few men of learning, abilities, and moderation, who, by discussing the disputed articles in an amicable conference, might explain them in such a manner as to bring the contending parties either to unite in sentiment or differ with charity. This speech, being printed in common form and dispersed over the empire, revived the fears and jealousies of the Protestants. Ferdinand, they observed with much surprise, had not once mentioned in his address to the Diet the Treaty of Passau, the stipulations of which they considered as the great security of their religious liberty. The suspicions to which this gave rise were confirmed by the accounts which were daily received of the extreme severity with which Ferdinand treated their Protestant brethren in his hereditary dominions, and as it was natural to consider his actions as the surest indication of his intentions, this diminished their confidence in those pompous professions of moderation and of zeal for the re-establishment of concord to which his practice seemed to be so repugnant. The arrival of the Cardinal Morone, whom the Pope had appointed to attend the Diet as his nuncio, completed their conviction and left them no room to doubt that some dangerous machination was forming against the peace or safety of the Protestant Church. Julius, elated with the unexpected return of the English nation from apostasy, began to flatter himself that, the spirit of mutiny and revolt having now spent its force, the happy period was come when the Church might resume its ancient authority and be obeyed by the people with the same tame submission as formerly. Full of these hopes, he had sent Morone to Augsburg with instructions to employ his eloquence to excite the Germans to imitate the laudable example of the English, and his political address in order to prevent any decree of the Diet to the detriment of the Catholic faith. But Julius died, and as soon as Morone heard of this, he set out abruptly from Augsburg, where he had resided only a few days, that he might be present at the election of the new pontiff. One cause of their fears and suspicions being thus removed, the Protestants soon became sensible that their conjectures concerning Ferdinand's intentions, however specious, were ill-founded, and that he had no thoughts of violating the articles favorable to them in the Treaty of Passau. Charles, from the time that Maurice had defeated all his schemes in the empire, and overturned the great system of religious and civil despotism which he had almost established there, gave little attention to the internal government of Germany, and permitted his brother to pursue whatever measures he judged most salutary and expedient. Ferdinand, less ambitious and enterprising than the emperor, instead of resuming a plan which he, with power and resources so far superior, had failed of accomplishing, endeavored to attach the princes of the empire to his family by an administration uniformly moderate and equitable. To this he gave at present particular attention, because his situation at this juncture rendered it necessary to court their favor and support with more than usual assiduity. Charles had again resumed his favorite project of acquiring the imperial crown for his son Philip, the prosecution of which the reception it had met with when first proposed had obliged him to suspend, but had not induced him to relinquish. This led him warmly to renew his request to his brother that he would accept of some compensation for his prior right of succession, and sacrifice that to the grandeur of the House of Austria. Ferdinand, who was as little disposed as formerly to give such an extraordinary proof of self-denial, being sensible that, in order to defeat this scheme, not only the most inflexible firmness on his part, but a vigorous declaration from the princes of the empire in behalf of his title were requisite, was willing to purchase their favor by gratifying them in every point that they deemed interesting or essential. At the same time, he stood in need of immediate and extraordinary aid from the Germanic body, as the Turks, after having wrested from him a great part of his Hungarian territories, were ready to attack the provinces still subject to his authority with a formidable army, against which he could bring no equal force into the field. For this aid from Germany he could not hope, if the internal peace of the empire were not established on a foundation solid in itself, and which should appear, even to the Protestants, so secure and so permanent as might not only allow them to engage in a distant war with safety, but might encourage them to act in it with vigor. A step taken by the Protestants themselves, a short time after the opening of the Diet, rendered him still more cautious of giving them any new cause of offense. As soon as the publication of Ferdinand's speech awakened the fears and suspicions which have been mentioned, the electors of Saxony and Brandenburg, together with the Landgrave of Hesse, met at Naumburg, and, confirming the ancient treaty of confraternity which had long united their families, they added to it a new article, by which the contracting parties bound themselves to adhere to the Confession of Augsburg, and to maintain the doctrine which it contained in their respective dominions. Ferdinand, influenced by all these considerations, employed his utmost address in conducting the deliberations of the Diet, so as not to excite the jealousy of a party on whose friendship he depended, and whose enmity, as they had not only taken the alarm, but had begun to prepare for their defense, he had so much reason to dread. The members of the Diet readily agreed to Ferdinand's proposal of taking the state of religion into consideration previous to any other business, but as soon as they entered upon it, both parties discovered all the zeal and animosity which a subject so interesting naturally engenders, and which the rancor of controversy, together with the violence of civil war, had inflamed to the highest pitch. The Protestants contended that the security which they claimed in consequence of the Treaty of Passau should extend without limitation to all who had hitherto embraced the doctrine of Luther, or who should thereafter embrace it. The Catholics, having first of all asserted the Pope's right as the supreme and final judge with respect to all articles of faith, declared that, though, on account of the present situation of the empire, and for the sake of peace, they were willing to confirm the toleration granted by the Treaty of Passau to such as had already adopted the new opinions, they must insist that this indulgence should not be extended either to those cities which had conformed to the interim, or to such ecclesiastics as should for the future apostatize from the Church of Rome. It was no easy matter to reconcile such opposite pretensions, which were supported on each side by the most elaborate arguments and the greatest acrimony of expression that the abilities or zeal of theologians long exercised in disputation could suggest. Ferdinand, however, by his address and perseverance, by softening some things on each side, by putting a favorable meaning upon others, by representing incessantly the necessity as well as the advantages of concord, and by threatening on some occasions, when all other considerations were disregarded, to dissolve the Diet, brought them at length to a conclusion in which they all agreed. Conformably to this, a recess was framed, approved of, and published with the usual formalities. The following are the chief articles which it contained: that such princes and cities as have declared their approbation of the Confession of Augsburg shall be permitted to profess the doctrine and exercise the worship which it authorizes, without interruption or molestation from the Emperor, the King of the Romans, or any power or person whatsoever; that the Protestants on their part shall give no disquiet to the princes and states who adhere to the tenets and rites of the Church of Rome; that for the future no attempt shall be made toward terminating religious differences, but by the gentle and pacific methods of persuasion and conference; that the popish ecclesiastics shall claim no spiritual jurisdiction in such states as received the Confession of Augsburg; that such as had seized the benefices or revenues of the Church previous to the Treaty of Passau shall retain possession of them, and be liable to no persecution in the imperial chamber on that account; that the supreme civil power in every state shall have the right to establish what form of doctrine and worship it shall deem proper, and if any of its subjects refuse to conform to these, shall permit them to remove with all their effects whithersoever they shall please; that if any prelate or ecclesiastic shall hereafter abandon the Romish religion, he shall instantly relinquish his diocese or benefice, and it shall be lawful for those in whom the right of nomination is vested to proceed immediately to an election, as if the office were vacant by death or translation, and to appoint a successor of undoubted attachment to the ancient system. Such are the capital articles in this famous recess, which is the basis of religious peace in Germany, and the bond of union among its various states, the sentiments of which are so extremely different with respect to points the most interesting as well as important. In our age and nation, to which the idea of toleration is familiar, and its beneficial effects well known, it may seem strange that a method of terminating their dissensions, so suitable to the mild and charitable spirit of the Christian religion, did not sooner occur to the contending parties. But this expedient, however salutary, was so repugnant to the sentiments and practice of Christians during many ages, that it did not lie obvious to discovery. Among the ancient heathens, all whose deities were local and tutelary, diversity of sentiments concerning the object or rites of religious worship seems to have been no source of animosity, because the acknowledging veneration to be due to any one god did not imply denial of the existence or the power of any other god, nor were the modes and rites of worship established in one country incompatible with those which other nations approved of and observed. Thus the errors in their system of theology were of such a nature as to be productive of concord, and notwithstanding the amazing number of their deities, as well as the infinite variety of their ceremonies, a sociable and tolerating spirit subsisted almost universally in the pagan world. But when the Christian revelation declared one supreme being to be the sole object of religious veneration, and prescribed the form of worship most acceptable to him, whoever admitted the truth of it held, of consequence, every other system of religion as a deviation from what was established by divine authority to be false and impious. Hence arose the zeal of the first converts to the Christian faith in propagating its doctrines, and the ardor with which they labored to overturn every other form of worship. They employed, however, for this purpose no methods but such as suited the nature of religion. By the force of powerful arguments they convinced the understandings of men. By the charms of superior virtue they allured and captivated their hearts. At length the civil power declared in favor of Christianity, and though numbers, imitating the example of their superiors, crowded into the church, many still adhered to their ancient superstitions. Enraged at their obstinacy, the ministers of religion, whose zeal was still unabated, though their sanctity and virtue were much diminished, forgot so far the nature of their own mission, and of the arguments which they ought to have employed, that they armed the imperial power against these unhappy men, and as they could not persuade, they tried to compel them to believe. The Diet of Augsburg was soon followed by the emperor's resignation of his hereditary dominions to his son Philip, together with his resolution to withdraw entirely from any concern in business or the affairs of this world, in order that he might spend the remainder of his days in retirement and solitude. Though it requires neither deep reflection nor extraordinary discernment to discover that the state of royalty is not exempt from cares and disappointment, though most of those who are exalted to a throne find solicitude and satiety and disgust to be their perpetual attendants in that envied preeminence, yet to descend voluntarily from the supreme to a subordinate station, and to relinquish the possession of power in order to attain the enjoyment of happiness, seems to be an effort too great for the human mind. Several instances indeed occur in history of monarchs who have quitted a throne and have ended their days in retirement, but they were either weak princes, who took this resolution rashly and repented of it as soon as it was taken, or unfortunate princes, from whose hands some stronger rival had wrested their sceptre, and compelled them to descend with reluctance into a private station. Diocletian is perhaps the only prince capable of holding the reins of government who ever resigned them from deliberate choice, and who continued during many years to enjoy the tranquillity of retirement, without fetching one penitent sigh, or casting back one look of desire toward the power or dignity which he had abandoned. No wonder, then, that Charles' resignation should fill all Europe with astonishment, and give rise, both among his contemporaries and among the historians of that period, to various conjectures concerning the motives which determined a prince whose ruling passion had been uniformly the love of power, at the age of 56, when objects of ambition continue to operate with full force on the mind, and are pursued with the greatest ardor, to take a resolution so singular and unexpected. But while many authors have imputed it to motives so frivolous and fantastical as can hardly be supposed to influence any reasonable mind, while others have imagined it to be the result of some profound scheme of policy, historians more intelligent and better informed neither ascribe it to caprice, nor search for mysterious secrets of state, where simple and obvious causes will fully account for the emperor's conduct. Charles had been attacked early in life with the gout, and notwithstanding all the precautions of the most skilful physicians, the violence of the distemper increased as he advanced in age, and the fits became every year more frequent as well as more severe. Not only was the vigor of his constitution broken, but the faculties of his mind were impaired by the excruciating torments which he endured. During the continuance of the fits, he was altogether incapable of applying to business, and even when they began to abate, as it was only at intervals that he could attend to what was serious, he gave up a great part of his time to trifling and even childish occupations, which served to relieve or amuse his mind, enfeebled and worn out with excess of pain. Under these circumstances, the conduct of such affairs as occurred, of course, in governing so many kingdoms was a burden more than sufficient. But to push forward and complete the vast schemes which the ambition of his more active years had formed, or to keep in view and carry on the great system of policy extending to every nation in Europe, and connected with the operations of every different court, were functions which so far exceeded his strength that they oppressed and overwhelmed his mind. As he had been long accustomed to view the business of every department, whether civil or military or ecclesiastical, with his own eyes, and to decide concerning it according to his own ideas, it gave him the utmost pain when he felt his infirmities increase so fast upon him that he was obliged to commit the conduct of all his affairs to his ministers. He imputed every misfortune which befell him, and every miscarriage that happened, even when the former was unavoidable or the latter accidental, to his inability to take the inspection of business himself. He complained of his hard fortune in being opposed in his declining years to a rival who was in the full vigor of life, and that while Henry could take and execute all his resolutions in person, he should now be reduced, both in counsel and in action, to rely on the talents and exertions of other men. Having thus grown old before his time, he wisely judged it more decent to conceal his infirmities in some solitude than to expose them any longer to the public eye. and prudently determined not to forfeit the fame or lose the acquisitions of his better years by struggling with a vain obstinacy to retain the reins of government when he was no longer able to hold them with steadiness or to guide them with address. But though Charles had resolved this scheme in his mind for several years, and had communicated it to his sisters, the Dowager Queens of France and Hungary, who not only approved of his intention, but offered to accompany him to whatever place of retreat he should choose, several things had hitherto prevented his carrying it into execution. He could not think of loading his son with the government of so many kingdoms until he should attain such maturity of age and of abilities as would enable him to sustain that weighty burden. But as Philip had now reached his 28th year, and had been early accustomed to business, for which he discovered both inclination and capacity, it can hardly be imputed to the partiality of paternal affection that his scruples with regard to this point were entirely removed, and that he thought he might place his son, without further hesitation or delay, on the throne which he himself was about to abandon. His mother's situation had been another obstruction in his way, for although she had continued almost 50 years in confinement, and under the same disorder of mind which concern for her husband's death had brought upon her, yet the government of Spain was still vested in her jointly with the emperor. Her name was inserted, together with his, in all public instruments ensued in that kingdom, and such was the fond attachment of the Spaniards to her, that they would probably have scrupled to recognize Philip as their sovereign, unless she had consented to assume him as her partner on the throne. Her utter incapacity for business rendered it impossible to obtain her consent. But her death, which happened this year, removed this difficulty, and as Charles, upon that event, became sole monarch of Spain, it left the succession open to his son. The war with France had likewise been a reason for retaining the administration of affairs in his own hands, as he was extremely solicitous to have terminated it, that he might have given up his kingdoms to his son at peace with all the world. But as Henry had discovered no disposition to close with any of his overtures, and had even rejected proposals of peace which were equal and moderate in a tone that seemed to indicate a fixed purpose of continuing hostilities, he saw that it was vain to wait longer in expectation of an event which, however desirable, was altogether uncertain. As this, then, appeared to be the proper juncture for executing the scheme which he had long meditated, Charles resolved to resign his kingdoms to his son with a solemnity suitable to the importance of the transaction, and to perform this last act of sovereignty with such formal pomp as might leave a lasting impression on the minds not only of his subjects, but of his successor. With this view he called Philip out of England, where the peevish temper of his queen, which increased with her despair of having issue, rendered him extremely unhappy, and the jealousy of the English left him no hopes of obtaining the direction of their affairs. Having assembled the states of the Low Countries at Brussels on October 25th, Charles seated himself for the last time in the chair of state, on one side of which was placed his son, on the other his sister, the Queen of Hungary, regent of the Netherlands, with a splendid retinue of the princes of the Empire and grandees of Spain standing behind him. The president of the Council of Flanders, by his command, explained in a few words his intention in calling this extraordinary meeting of the states. He then read the instrument of resignation, by which Charles surrendered to his son Philip all his territories, jurisdiction, and authority in the Low Countries, absolving his subjects there from their oath of allegiance to him, which he required them to transfer to Philip, his lawful heir, and to serve him with the same loyalty and zeal which they had manifested during so long a course of years in support of his government. Charles then rose from his seat, and leaning on the shoulder of the Prince of Orange, because he was unable to stand without support, he addressed himself to the audience, and from a paper which he held in his hand, in order to assist his memory, he recounted with dignity, but without ostentation, all the great things which he had undertaken and performed since the commencement of his administration. He observed that, from the 17th year of his age, he had dedicated all his thoughts and attention to public objects, reserving no portion of his time for the indulgence of his ease, and very little for the enjoyment of private pleasure. That, either in a pacific or hostile manner, he had visited Germany 9 times, Spain 6 times, France 4 times, Italy 7 times, the Low Countries 10 times, England twice, Africa as often, and had made 11 voyages by sea. That while his health permitted him to discharge his duty, and the vigor of his constitution was equal in any degree to the arduous office of governing such extensive dominions, he had never shunned labor, nor repined under fatigue. That now, when his health was broken, and his vigor exhausted by the rage of an incurable distemper, his growing infirmities admonished him to retire, Nor was he so fond of reigning as to retain the scepter in an impotent hand, which was no longer able to protect his subjects, or to secure to them the happiness which he wished they should enjoy. That instead of a sovereign worn out with diseases and scarcely half alive, gave them one in the prime of life, accustomed already to govern, and who added to the vigor of youth all the attention and sagacity of maturer years. And if, during the course of a long administration, he had committed any material error of government, or if, under the pressure of so many and great affairs, and amid the attention which he had been obliged to give them, he had either neglected or injured any of his subjects, he now implored their forgiveness. That for his part he should ever retain a grateful sense of their fidelity and attachment, and would carry the remembrance of it along with him to the place of his retreat, as his sweetest consolation, as well as the best reward for all his services, and in his last prayers to Almighty God would pour forth his most earnest petitions for their welfare. Then, turning toward Philip, who fell on his knees and kissed his father's hand, "If," said he, "I had left you by my death this rich inheritance, to which I have made such large additions, some regard would have been justly due to my memory on that account. But now, when I voluntarily resign to you what I might have still retained, I may well expect the warmest expression of thanks on your part. With these, however, I dispense, and shall consider your concern for the welfare of your subjects, and your love of them, as the best and most acceptable testimony of your gratitude to me. It is in your power, by a wise and virtuous administration, to justify the extraordinary proof which I this day give of my paternal affection, and to demonstrate that you are worthy of the confidence which I repose in you. Preserve an inviolable regard for religion. Maintain the Catholic faith in its purity. Let the laws of your country be sacred in your eyes. Encroach not on the rights and privileges of your people, and if the time should ever come when you shall wish to enjoy the tranquillity of private life, may you have a son endowed with such qualities that you can resign your scepter to him with as much satisfaction as I give mine up to you." As soon as Charles had finished this long address to his subjects and to their new sovereign, he sank into the chair, exhausted and ready to faint with the fatigue of such an extraordinary effort. During his discourse the whole audience melted into tears, some from admiration of his magnanimity, others softened by the expressions of tenderness toward his son, and of love to his people, and all were affected with the deepest sorrow at losing a sovereign who, during his administration, had distinguished the Netherlands, his native country, with particular marks of his regard and attachment. Philip then arose from his knees, and after returning thanks to his father, with a low and submissive voice, for the royal gift which his unexampled bounty had bestowed upon him, he addressed the assembly of the States, and, regretting his inability to speak the Flemish language with such facility as to express what he felt on this interesting occasion, as well as what he owed his good subjects in the Netherlands, he begged that they would permit Granvelle, Bishop of Arras, to deliver what he had given him in charge to speak in his name. Granvelle, in a long discourse, expatiated on the zeal with which Philip was animated for the good of his subjects, on his resolution to devote all his time and talents to the promoting of their happiness, and on his intention to imitate his father's example in distinguishing the Netherlands with peculiar marks of his regard. Mays, a lawyer of great eloquence, replied in the name of the States, with large professions of their fidelity and affection to their new sovereign. Then Mary, Queen Dowager of Hungary, resigned the regency with which she had been entrusted by her brother during the space of 25 years. Next day Philip, in the presence of the States, took the usual oaths to maintain the rights and privileges of his subjects, and all the members, in their own name and in that of their constituents, swore allegiance to him. A few weeks after this transaction, Charles, in an assembly no less splendid and with a ceremonial equally pompous, resigned to his son the crowns of Spain, with all the territories depending on them, in both the Old and in the New World. Of all these vast possessions, he reserved nothing for himself but an annual pension of 100,000 crowns, to defray the charges of his family, and to afford him a small sum for acts of beneficence and charity. As he had fixed on a place of retreat in Spain, hoping that the dryness and the warmth of the climate in that country might mitigate the violence of his disease, which had been much increased by the moisture of the air and rigor of the winters in the Netherlands, he was extremely impatient to embark for that kingdom, and to disengage himself entirely from business, which he found to be impossible while he remained in Brussels. But his physicians remonstrated so strongly against his venturing to sea at that cold and boisterous season of the year, that he consented, though with reluctance, to put off his voyage for some months. He retained the imperial dignity, not from any unwillingness to relinquish it, for after having resigned the real and extensive authority that he enjoyed in his hereditary dominions, to part with the limited and often ideal jurisdiction which belongs to an elective crown was no great sacrifice. His sole motive for delay was to gain a few months for making one trial more, in order to accomplish his favorite scheme in behalf of his son. At the very time Charles seemed to be most sensible of the vanity of worldly grandeur, and when he appeared to be quitting it not only with indifference but with contempt, the vast schemes of ambition which had so long occupied and engrossed his mind still kept possession of it. He could not think of leaving his son in a rank inferior to that which he himself had held among the princes of Europe, as he had some years before made a fruitless attempt to secure the imperial crown to Philip, that by uniting it to the kingdoms of Spain and the dominions of the house of Burgundy, he might put it in his power to prosecute, with a better prospect of success, those great plans which his own infirmities had obliged him to abandon. He was still unwilling to relinquish this flattering project as chimerical or unattainable. Notwithstanding the repulse which he had formerly met with from his brother Ferdinand, he renewed his solicitations with fresh importunity, and during the summer had tried every art, and employed every argument, which he thought could induce him to quit the imperial throne to Philip, and to accept of the investiture of some province, either in Italy or in the Low Countries, as an equivalent. But Ferdinand, who was so firm and inflexible with regard to this point that he had paid no regard to the solicitations of the emperor, even when they were enforced with all the weight of authority which accompanies supreme power, received the overture that now came from him in the situation to which he had descended with great indifference, and would hardly deign to listen to it. Charles, ashamed of his own credulity, and having imagined that he might accomplish now that which he had attempted formerly without success, desisted finally from his scheme. He then resigned the government of the empire, and having transferred all his claims of obedience and allegiance from the Germanic body to his brother the King of the Romans, he executed a deed to that effect, with all the formalities requisite in such an important transaction. The instrument of resignation he committed to William, Prince of Orange, and empowered him to lay it before the College of Electors. Nothing now remained to detain Charles from that retreat for which he languished. The preparations for his voyage having been made for some time, he set out for Zoutberg in Zealand, where the fleet which was to convoy him had orders to assemble. In this way thither he passed through Ghent, and after stopping there a few days to indulge that tender and pleasing melancholy which arises in the mind of every man in the decline of life on visiting the place of his nativity, and viewing the scenes and objects familiar to him in his early youth, he pursued his journey, accompanied by his son Philip, his daughter the Archduchess, his sisters the Dowager Queens of France and Hungary, Maximilian his son-in-law, and a numerous retinue of the French nobility. Before he went on board, he dismissed them with marks of his attention or regard, and taking leave of Philip with all the tenderness of a father who embraced his son for the last time, he set sail on September 17th, under the convoy of a large fleet of Spanish, Flemish, and English ships. He declined a pressing invitation from the Queen of England to land in some part of her dominions, in order to refresh himself, and that she might have the comfort of seeing him once more. "It cannot surely," said he, "be agreeable to a queen to receive a visit from a father-in-law who is now nothing more than a private gentleman." His voyage was prosperous, and he arrived at Laredo in Biscay on the 11th day after he left Zealand. As soon as he landed, he fell prostrate on the ground, and considering himself now as dead to the world, he kissed the earth and said, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked I now return to thee, thou common mother of mankind." From Laredo he pursued his journey to Burgos, carried sometimes in a chair and sometimes in a horse litter, suffering exquisite pain at every step, and advancing with the greatest difficulty. Some of the Spanish nobility repaired to Burgos in order to pay court to him, but they were so few in number, and their attendance was so negligent, Charles observed it and felt for the first time that he was no longer a monarch. Accustomed from his early youth to the dutiful and officious respect with which those who possess sovereign power are attended, he had received it with the credulity common to princes, and was sensibly mortified when he now discovered that he had been indebted to his rank and power for much of that obsequious regard which he had fondly thought was paid to his personal qualities. But though he might have soon learned to view with unconcern the levity of his subjects, or to have despised their neglect, he was more deeply afflicted with the ingratitude of his son, who, forgetting already how much he owed to his father's bounty, obliged him to remain some weeks at Burgos before he paid him the first moiety of that small pension all that he had reserved of so many kingdoms. As without this sum Charles could not dismiss his domestics with such rewards as their services merited, or his generosity had destined for them, he could not help expressing both surprise and dissatisfaction. At last the money was paid, and Charles, having dismissed a great number of his domestics, whose attendance he thought would be superfluous or cumbersome in his retirement, he proceeded to Valladolid. There he took a last and tender leave of his 2 sisters, whom he would not permit to accompany him to his solitude, though they requested him with tears, not only that they might have the consolation of contributing by their attendance and care to mitigate or soothe his sufferings, but that they might reap instruction and benefit by joining with him in those pious exercises to which he had consecrated the remainder of his days. From Valladolid he continued his journey to Placentia in Estremadura. He had passed through this place a great many years before, and having been struck at that time with the delightful situation of the monastery of St. Justus, belonging to the order of St. Jerome, not many miles distant from the town, he had then observed to some of his attendants that this was a spot to which Diocletian might have retired with pleasure. The impression had remained so strong in his mind that he pitched upon it as the place of his own retreat. It was seated in a vale of no great extent, watered by a small brook, and surrounded by rising grounds covered with lofty trees. From the nature of the soil, as well as the temperature of the climate, it was esteemed the most healthful and delicious situation in Spain. Some months before his resignation, he had sent an architect thither to add a new apartment to the monastery for his accommodation, but he gave strict orders that the style of the building should be such as suited his present station rather than his former dignity. It consisted only of 6 rooms, 4 of them in the form of friars' cells with naked walls. The other 2, each 20 feet square, were hung with brown cloth and furnished in the most simple manner. They were all on a level with the ground, with a door on one side into a garden, of which Charles himself had given the plan, and had filled it with various plants which he intended to cultivate with his own hands. On the other side they communicated with the chapel of the monastery, in which he was to perform his devotions. Into this humble retreat, hardly sufficient for the comfortable accommodation of a private gentleman, did Charles enter, with 12 domestics only. He buried there, in solitude and silence, his grandeur, his ambition, together with all those vast projects which during almost half a century had alarmed and agitated Europe, filling every kingdom in it by turns with the terror of his arms and the dread of being subdued by his power. End of section 33.
Section 34 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Akbar establishes the Mogul Empire, A.D. 1556, by J. Talboys Wheeler. Between the years 1494 and 1526, Babur, great-grandson of Timur, Tamerlane, the Tartar conqueror, made extensive conquests in India. There he laid the first foundations of the Mahometan Tartar Empire of the Moguls, as his followers are called. This empire reached its height under Akbar, Jalal-ad-Din Muhammad, who succeeded his father Humayun, son of Babur, in 1556. Humayun did little toward uniting the various territories which Babur had conquered. Akbar was the contemporary of Queen Elizabeth of England, and his reign is as important in the history of India as is hers in the history of the Western world. He ascended the throne at the age of 14. At the time of his accession, he was in the Punjab, warring against the revolted Afghans. The commander of the Mogul armies was Bairam Khan, and when Humayun died, that general became Akbar's guardian. Wheeler's account of this great ruler's achievements presents throughout a most interesting portrayal of his personality and character, and is especially remarkable for its simplicity and its oriental atmosphere. The reign of Akbar bears a strange resemblance to that of Ashoka. Footnote: Ashoka was an illustrious king of the Maurya dynasty in India who died about BC 225. He did much for the advancement of Buddhism and has been called the Buddhist Constantine. End of footnote. Indeed, the likeness between Akbar and Ashoka is one of the most remarkable phenomena in history. They were separated from each other by an interval of 18 centuries. The main features of their respective lives were practically the same. Ashoka was putting down revolt in the Punjab when his father died, so was Akbar. Ashoka was occupied for years in conquering and consolidating his empire, so was Akbar. Ashoka conquered India to the north of the Nerbudda, so did Akbar. Ashoka was tolerant of other religions, so was Akbar. Ashoka went against the priests, so did Akbar. Ashoka taught a religion of his own, so did Akbar. Ashoka abstained from flesh meat, so did Akbar. In the end, Ashoka took refuge in Buddha, the law, and the assembly. In the end, Akbar recited the formula of Islam. There is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Some of these coincidences are mere accidents. Others reveal a similarity in the current of religious thought, a similarity in the stages of religious development. Consequently, they add a new chapter to the history of mankind. The wars of Akbar are only interesting so far as they bring out types of character. When the news reached the Punjab that Humayun was dead, other news arrived. Hemu had recovered Agra and Delhi. He was advancing with a large army into the Punjab. The Mogul force was very small. The Mogul officers were in a panic. They advised a retreat into Kabul. Akbar and Bairam Khan resolved on a battle. The Afghans were routed. The Hindu general was wounded in the eye and taken prisoner. Bairam Khan bade Akbar slay the Hindu and win the title of champion of the faith. Akbar drew his sword, but shrunk back. He was as brave as a lion. He would not hack a wounded prisoner. Bairam Khan had no such sentiment. He beheaded Hemu with his own sword. This story marks the contrast between the prince and his guardian. Akbar was brave and skillful in the field. He was outwardly gracious and forgiving when the fight was over. Bairam Khan was loyal to the throne. He slaughtered enemies in cold blood without mercy. It was impossible that the two should agree. Akbar grew more and more impatient of his guardian. For years he was self-constrained at Rama. He thought a great deal, but did nothing. He bided his time. Within 4 years, Bairam Khan had laid the foundations of the Mughal Empire. Its limits were as yet restricted. The Mughal Pale only covered the Punjab, the northwest provinces, and Oudh. It is only extended from the Indus to the junction of the Jumna and Ganges. On the south it was bounded by Rajputana. It included the 3 capitals of Lahore, Delhi, and Agra. So far it coincided with the kingdom of Alauddin, who conquered the Deccan and Peninsula. At the end of the 4 years, Akbar was a young man of 18. He resolved to throw off the authority of his guardian. He carried out his designs with the artifice of an Asiatic. He pretended that his mother was sick. He left the camp where Bairam Khan commanded in order to pay her a visit. He proclaimed that he had assumed the authority of Padishah, that no orders were to be obeyed save his own. Bairam Khan was taken by surprise. Possibly, had he known what was coming, he would have put Akbar out of the way, but his power was gone. He tried to work upon the feelings of Akbar. He found that the Padishah was inflexible. He revolted, but was defeated and forgiven. Akbar offered him any post save that of minister. He would be minister or nothing. In the end, he elected to go to Mecca, the last refuge for Mussulman statesmen. Everything was ready for his embarkation. Suddenly, he was assassinated by an Afghan. It was the old story of Afghan revenge. He had killed the father of the assassin in some battle. In revenge, the son had stabbed him to death. Akbar was now free to act. The political situation was one of extreme peril. The Afghans were fighting one another in Kabul in the northwest. They were also fighting one another in Bihar and Bengal in the southeast. When he marched against one, his territories were exposed to the raids of the other. Meanwhile, his Mogul officers often set his sovereignty at defiance. When brought to task, they broke out in mutiny and rebellion. Two events at this period will show the actual state of affairs. Far away in the south of Rajputana lies the remote territory of Malwa. It was originally conquered by Alauddin. During the decline of the Tughlaqs, the governor Malwa became an independent ruler. At the beginning of the reign of Akbar, Baz Bahadur was ruler of Malwa. He was a type of the Mussulman princes of the time. No doubt he went to mosque. He surrounded himself with Hindu singing and dancing girls. He became more or less Hinduized. Akbar sent an officer named Adham Khan to conquer Malwa. Adham Khan had no difficulty. Baz Bahadur abandoned his treasures and harem and fled. Adham Khan distributed part of the spoil to the Padishah. Akbar could not brook such disobedience. Notwithstanding the distance, he hurried to Malwa. He received his rightful share of the plunder. He professed to accept the excuses of the defaulter. When he returned to Agra, he recalled Adham Khan to court. He sent another governor to Malwa. Adham Khan obeyed. He went to Agra. He found that he had lost favor. Commands were given to others. He could get nothing. He was driven mad by delay and disappointment. He did not suspect Akbar. He threw the blame upon the minister. One day he went to the palace. He stabbed the minister to death in the hall of audience. He ran up to an outer terrace. Akbar heard the uproar. He rushed in and beheld the bleeding corpse. He saw the stupefied murderer on the terrace. He half drew his sword, but remembered himself. Adham Khan seized his hands and begged for mercy. Akbar shook him off and ordered the servants to throw him from the terrace. The order was obeyed. Adham Khan was killed on the spot. Another officer, named Khan Zaman, played a similar game in Bihar. He was warned that Akbar was on the move. He escaped punishment by making over the spoil before Akbar came up. This satisfied Akbar. He returned part of the spoil and went back to Agra. Henceforth, Khan Zaman was a rebel at heart. Some Uzbek chiefs revolted in Oudh. They were joined by Khan Zaman. Akbar was called away to the Punjab by an Afghan invasion. On his return, the rebels were in possession of Oudh and Allahabad. Akbar marched against them in the middle of the rains. He outstripped his army. He reached the Ganges with only his bodyguard. The rebels were encamped on the opposite bank. They had no fear. They expected Akbar to wait until his army came up. That night Akbar swam the river with his bodyguard. At daybreak he attacked the enemy. The rebels heard the thunder of the imperial kettle drums. They could not believe their ears. They fled in all directions. Khan Zaman was slain in the pursuit. The other leaders were taken prisoner. They were trampled to death by elephants. Thus, for a while, the rebellion was stamped out. These incidents are only types of others. In plain truth, the Mussulman power in India had spent its force. The Brotherhood of Islam had ceased to bind together conflicting races. It could not hold together men of the same race. The struggle between Shia and Sunni was dividing the world of Islam. Moguls, Turks, and Afghans were fighting against each other. They were also fighting amongst themselves. Rebels of different races were combining against the Padishah. Meanwhile, any scruples that remained against fighting fellow Mussulmans were a hindrance to Akbar in putting down revolts. The Mussulman power was crumbling to pieces. The dismemberment had begun 2 centuries earlier in the revolt of the Deccan. Since the strength which remained in the scattered fragments was wasted in wars and revolts, the whole country was drifting into anarchy. No one could save the empire but a born statesman. Akbar had already proved himself a born soldier. Had he been only a soldier, he might still have held his own against Afghans and Uzbeks from Peshawar to Allahabad. Had he been bloodthirsty and merciless, like Bayram Khan, he might have stamped out revolt and mutiny by massacre and terrorism. But he would have left no mark in history, no lessons for posterity, no political ideas for the education of the world. He might have made a name like Genghis Khan or Timur, but the story of his life would have dropped into oblivion. After his death, every evil that festered in the body politic would have broken out afresh. His successors would have inherited the same wars, the same revolts, and the same mutinies. Unless they had inherited his capacity, they would have died out in anarchy and in revolution. Akbar had never been educated. He had never learned to write, nor even to read. He had not gone with his father to Persia, where he might have been schooled in Mussulman learning. He had spent a joyless boyhood with a cruel uncle in Kabul. He had been schooled in nothing but war. But he had listened to histories and pondered over histories until grand ideas began to seethe in his brain. The problem before him was the resuscitation of the empire, or rather, the creation of a new empire out of the existing chaos. Fresh blood was wanted to infuse life and strength into the body politic, to enable the Mogul Shias to subdue the Afghan Sunnis. Akbar saw with the eye of genius that the necessary force was latent in the Rajputs. Henceforth, he devoted all the energies of his nature to bring that force into healthy play. In 1575, Akbar was about 34 years of age. 20 years had passed away since the boy had been installed as Padishah. He had not as yet conquered Kabul in the northwest, nor Bengal in the southeast. He had not made any sensible advance into the Deccan. But he had gained a succession of victories. He had restored order in the Punjab and Hindustan. He had subdued Malwa, Gujarat, and Rajputana. Many Rajputs were still in arms against him. He had nothing to fear from them. He had fixed his capital at Agra. His favorite residence, however, was at Fatehpur Sikri, about 12 miles from Agra. It is easy to individualize Akbar. He was haughty, like all the Moguls. He was outwardly clement and affable. He was tall and handsome, broad in the chest and long in the arms. His complexion was ruddy, a nut brown. He had a good appetite and a good digestion. His strength was prodigious. His courage was very remarkable. While yet a boy, he displayed prodigies of valor in the battle against Himu. He would spring on the backs of elephants who had killed their keepers. He would compel them to do his bidding. He kept a herd of dromedaries. He gained his victories by the rapidity of his marches. He was an admirable marksman. He had a favorite gun which had brought him thousands of game. With that same gun he shot Jaimal the Rajput at the siege of Chittor. Akbar, like his father and grandfather, professed to be a Mussulman. His mother was a Persian. He was a Persian in his thoughts and ways. He was imbued with the old Mogul instinct of toleration. He was lax and indifferent without the semblance of zeal. He consulted soothsayers who divined with burnt ram's bones. He celebrated the Persian festival of the Nowruz, or New Year, which had no connection with Islam. He reverenced the 7 heavenly bodies by wearing a dress of different color every day in the week. He joined in the Brahmanical worship and sacrifices of his Rajput queens. Still, he was outwardly a Mussulman. He had no sons. He vowed that if a son was born to him, he would walk to the tomb of a Mussulman saint at Ajmer. It was more than 200 miles from Fatihpur. In 1570, his eldest son Seli was born. Akbar walked to Ajmer. He offered up his prayers at the tomb. Meanwhile, the ulama were growing troublesome at Agra. The ulama comprised the collective body of Mussulman doctors and lawyers who resided at the capital. The ulama have always possessed great weight in a Mussulman state. Judges, magistrates, and law officers in general are chosen from their number. Consequently, the opinion of the collective body was generally received as the final authority. The ulama at Agra were bigoted Sunnis. They hated and persecuted the Shias. Especially they persecuted the teachers of the Sufi heresy, which had grown up in Persia and was spreading in India. They had grown in power under the Afghan sultans. They had been quiet in the days of Humayun and Bayram Khan. Both were confessedly Shias. The ulama were too courtly to offend the power which appointed the law officers. When, however, Akbar threw over Bayram Khan and asserted his own sovereignty, the ulama became more active. They were anxious to keep the young Padishah in the right way. Akbar and his vizier, Abul Fazl, were certainly men of genius. They are still the bright lights of Indian history. They were the foremost men of their time, but each had a characteristic weakness. Akbar was a born Mogul. With all his good qualities, he was proud, ignorant, inquisitive, and self-sufficient. Abul Fazl was a born courtier. With all his good qualities, he was a flatterer, a time-server, and a eulogist. He made Akbar his idol. He bowed down and worshipped him. They became close friends. They were indeed necessary to each other. Akbar looked to his minister for praise. Abul Fazl looked to his master for advancement. It is difficult to admire the genius of Akbar without seeing that he has been worked upon by Abul Fazl. It is equally difficult to admire the genius of Abul Fazl without seeing that he is pandering to the vanity of Akbar. When Akbar made the acquaintance of Abul Fazl, he was in sore perplexity. He was determined to rule men of all creeds with even hand. The ulama were thwarting him. The Chief Justice at Agra had sentenced men to death for being Shias and heretics. The ulama were urging the Padishah to do the same. He was reluctant to quarrel with them. He was still more reluctant to sanction their high-handed proceedings towards men who worshipped the same God, but after a different fashion. How far Akbar opened his soul to Abul Fazl is unknown. No doubt Abul Fazl read his thoughts. Indeed, he had his own wrongs to avenge. The ulama had persecuted his father and driven him into exile. The ulama were ignorant, bigoted, and puffed up with pride and orthodoxy. Their learning was confined to Arabic and the Quran. They ignored what they did not know and could not understand. Abul Fazl must have hated and despised them. He was far too courtly, too astute to express his real sentiments. The ulama were at variance with the Padishah. They were also at variance among themselves. Possibly he foresaw that if they disputed before Akbar, they might excite his contempt. How far he worked upon Akbar can never be ascertained. In the end, Akbar ordered that the ulama should discuss all questions in his presence. He would then decide who was right and who was wrong. There is no evidence that Abul Fazl suggested this course. It was, however, the kind of incense that a courtier would offer to a sovereign like Akbar. The learned men were to lay their opinions before the Padishah. He was to sit and judge. If he needed help, Abul Fazl would be at his side. Indeed, Abul Fazl would ask questions and invite opinions. He, the Padishah, would only hear and decide. Accordingly, preparations were made for the coming debates. The discussions were held on Thursday evenings. They were carried on in a large pavilion. It was built for the purpose in the royal garden at Fatehpur Sikri. All the learned men at Agra were invited to attend. The Padishah and all the grandees of the empire were present. Abul Fazl acted as a kind of director. He started questions. He expounded his master's policy of toleration. Akbar preserved his dignity as Padishah. He listened with majestic gravity to all that was said. Occasionally he bestowed praises and presents upon the best speakers. For many evenings the proceedings were conducted with due decorum. As, however, the speakers grew accustomed to the presence of the Padishah, the spirit of dissension began to work. One evening it led to an uproar. Learned men reviled each other before the Padishah. No doubt Abul Fazl did his best to make the ulama uncomfortable. He shifted the discussion from one point to another. He started dangerous subjects. He placed them in dilemmas. If they sought to please the Padishah, they sinned against the Quran. If they stuck to the Quran, they offended the Padishah. A question was started as to Akbar's marriages. One orthodox magistrate was too conscientious to hold his tongue. He was removed from his post. The courtiers saw that the Padishah delighted in the discomfiture of the ulama with inconsistency, trickery, and cheating. The law officers were unable to defend themselves. Their authority and orthodoxy was set at naught. They were fast drifting into disgrace and ruin. They had cursed one another in their speech. Probably in their hearts they were all agreed in cursing Abul Fazl. By this time Akbar held the ulama in small esteem. He was growing skeptical of their religion. He had listened to the history of the caliphate. He yearned towards Ali and his family. He became in heart a Shia. Already he may have doubted Muhammad and the Quran. Still he was outwardly a Mussulman. His object now was to overthrow the ulama altogether, to become himself the supreme spiritual head, the Pope or Caliph of Islam. Abul Fazl was laboring to invest him with the same authority. He mooted the question one Thursday evening. He raised a storm of opposition. For this he was prepared. He had started the idea. He exerted all his tact and skill to carry it out. The debates proved that there were differences of opinion among the ulama. Abul Fazl urged that there were differences of opinion between the highest Muslim authorities, between those who were accepted as infallible and were known as mujtahids. He thus inserted the thin edge of the wedge. He proposed that when the mujtahids disagreed, the decision should be left to the Padishah. Weeks and months passed away in these discussions. Nothing could be said against the measure excepting that it would prove offensive to the Padishah. Meanwhile, a document was drawn up in the names of the chief men among the ulama. It gave the Padishah the power of deciding between the conflicting authorities. It gave him the still more dangerous power of issuing fresh decrees, provided they were in accordance with some verse of the Quran and were manifestly for the benefit of the people. The document was in the handwriting of Sheikh Mubarak. Abul Fazl, Abul Faiz, and probably Akbar himself had each a hand in the composition. The chief men among the ulama were required to sign it. Perhaps, if they had been priests or divines, they might have resisted to the last. But they were magistrates and judges. Their posts and emoluments were in danger. In the end, they signed it in sheer desperation. From that day, the power of the ulama was gone. They had abdicated their authority to the padishah. They became mere ciphers in Islam. A worse lot befell their leaders. The head of the ulama and the obnoxious chief justice were removed from their posts and forced to go to Mecca. The breaking up of the ulama is an epoch in history of Muslim India. The ulama may have been ignorant and bigoted. They may have sought to keep religions and the government of the empire within the narrow grooves of orthodoxy. Nevertheless, they had played an important part throughout Muslim rule. As exponents of the law of Muhammad, they had often proved a salutary check upon despotism of the sovereign. They had forced every minister, governor, and magistrate to respect the fundamental principles of the Quran. They led and controlled public opinion among the Muslim population. They formed the only body in the state that ever ventured to oppose the will of the sovereign. The Thursday evenings had done their work. Within 4 years they had broken up the power of the ulama. Abul Fazl had another project in his brain. It combined the audacity of genius with the mendacity of a courtier. He declared that Akbar was himself the 12th Imam, the lord of the period, who was to reconcile the 72 sects of Islam, to regenerate the world, to usher in the millennium. The announcement took the court by surprise. It fitted, however, into current ideas. It paved the way for further assumptions. Akbar grasped the notion with eagerness. It fascinated him for the remainder of his life. It bound him in the closest ties of friendship and confidence with Abul Fazl. The religious life of Akbar had undergone a vast change. He was testing religion by morality and reason. His faith in Islam was fading away. Muhammad had married a girl of 10. He had taken another man's wife. Therefore, he could not have been a prophet sent by God. Akbar disbelieved the story of his night journey to heaven. Meanwhile, Akbar was eagerly learning the mysteries of other religions. He entertained Brahmins, Sufis, Parsis, and Christian fathers. He believed in the transmigration of the soul, in the Supreme Spirit, in the ecstatic reunion of the soul with God, in the deity of fire and the sun. He leaned toward Christianity. He rejected the Trinity and Incarnation. The gravitations of Akbar toward Christianity are invested with singular interest. He had been impressed with what he heard of the Portuguese in India. Their large ships, impregnable forts, and big guns. He sent a letter to the Portuguese viceroy at Goa, inviting Christian fathers to come to his court at Fatehpur Sikri and instruct him in the sacred books. The religious world at Goa was thrown into a ferment at the prospect of converting the great Mogul. Every priest in Goa prayed that he might be sent on the mission. 3 fathers were dispatched to Fatehpur, which was more than 1,200 miles away. Akbar awaited their arrival with the utmost impatience. He received them with every mark of favor. They delivered their presents, consisting of a polyglot Bible in 4 languages and the images of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. To their unspeakable delights, the great Mogul placed the Bible on his head and kissed the images. So eager was he for instruction that he spent the whole night in conversation with the fathers. He provided them with lodgings in the precincts of his palace. He permitted them to set up a chapel and altar. Akbar had ceased to be a Mussulman. he still maintained appearances. He set apart Saturday evenings for controversies between the fathers and the mullahs. In the end, the fathers convinced Akbar of the superiority of Christianity. They contrasted the sensualities of Muhammad with the pure morality of the gospel, the wars of Muhammad and the caliphs with the preachings and sufferings of the apostles. The Mussulman historian curses the fathers. He states that Akbar became a Christian. The fathers, however, could never induce Akbar to be baptized. He gave them his favorite son, Amurat, a boy of 13, to be educated in Christianity and the European sciences. He directed Abul Fazl to prepare a translation of the Gospel. He entered the chapel of the fathers and prostrated himself before the image of the Savior. He permitted the fathers to preach Christianity in any part of his empire, to perform their rites in public, in opposition to Mussulman law. A Portuguese was buried at Fatehpur with all the pomp of the Roman Catholic ritual. The cross was carried through the streets for the first time. But Akbar would not become a Christian. He waited, he said, for the divine illumination. Quote, he hated the Mussulman religion. He overthrew the mosques and converted them into stables. He trusted and employed the Hindus more than the Mussulmans. Many of the Mussulmans rebelled against him. They stirred up his brother, the governor of Kabul, to take up arms against him. But Akbar defeated the rebels and restored order. It is uncertain what really was the religion of Akbar. Some said that he was a Hindu, others that he was a Christian. Some said that he belonged to a fourth sect, which was not connected with either of these three others. He acknowledged one God who was best content with a variety of sects and worshippings. Early in the morning, and again at noon, evening, and midnight, he worshipped the sun. He belonged to a new sect, of which the followers regarded him as their prophet. End of quote. Akbar was no fanatic. He was not carried away by religious craze. His religion was the outcome of his policy. It was political rather than superstitious. It began with him and ended with him. Probably the lack of fanaticism caused its failure. Abul Fazl speaks of the numbers who joined it. The list which he has preserved only contains the names of 18 courtiers, including himself, his father, and his brother. Only one Hindu is on the list, namely Birbar, the Brahman. Akbar tried hard to improve the morals of his subjects, Hindus as well as Mussulmans. He placed restrictions upon prostitution. He severely punished seducers. He permitted the use of wine. He punished intoxication. He prohibited the slaughter of cows. He forbade the marriage of boys before they were 16, of girls before they were 14. He permitted the marriage of Hindu widows. He tried to stop sati among the Hindus and polygamy among the Mussulmans. There was much practical simplicity in Akbar's character. It showed itself in a variety of ways. It was not peculiar to Akbar. It was an instinct which shows itself in Moguls generally. His emirs cheated him by bringing borrowed horses to muster. He stopped them by branding every horse with the name of the emir to which it belonged, as well as with the imperial mark. He appointed writers to record everything he said or did. He sent writers into every city and province to report to him everything that was going on. He hung up a bell at the palace. Any man who had a grievance might ring the bell and obtain a hearing. Akbar was very inquisitive. He sent an expedition to discover the sources of the Ganges. He made a strange experiment to discover what language was first spoken by mankind. This experiment is typical of the man. The Mussulmans declared that the first language was Arabic. The Jews said it was Hebrew. The Brahman said it was Sanskrit. Akbar ordered 12 infants to be brought up by dumb nurses. Not a word was to be spoken in their presence until they were 12 years of age. When the time arrived, the children were brought before Akbar. Proficients in the learned tongues were present to catch the first words, to decide upon the language to which it belonged. The children could not say a word. They spoke only by signs. The experiment was an utter failure. The character of Akbar had its dark side. He was sometimes harsh and cruel. His persecution of the Mussulmans was unpardonable. He had another way of getting rid of his enemies which is revolting to civilization. He kept a prisoner in his pay. He carried a box with 3 compartments, one for battle, another for digestive pills, a third for poison pills. No one dared to refuse to eat what was offered him by the Padishah. The offer was esteemed an honor. How many were poisoned by Akbar is unknown. The practice was in full force during the reigns of his successors. Akbar required his emirs to prostrate themselves before him. This rule gave great offense to Mussulmans. Prostration is worship. No strict Mussulman will perform worship except when offering his prayers to God. Abul Fazl says that Akbar ordered it to be discontinued. The point is doubtful. It was certainly performed by members of the quote-unquote divine faith. It was also performed during the reign of his son and successor. The Mogul government was pure despotism. Every governor and viceroy was supreme within his province. The Padishah was supreme throughout his empire. There was nothing to check provincial rulers but fear of the Padishah. There was nothing to check the Padishah but fear of rebellion. All previous Mussulman sovereigns had been checked by the ulama and the authority of the Quran. Akbar had broken up the ulama and set aside the Quran. He governed the empire according to his will. His will was law. The old Mogul Khans had held diets. No trace of a diet is to be found in the history of Mogul India prior to the reign of Aurangzeb. There may have been a semblance of a diet on the accession of a new Padishah. All the emirs, rajas, and princes of the empire paid their homage, presented gifts, and received titles and honors. But there was no council or parliament of any sort or kind. The Padishah was one and supreme. Akbar dwelt many years at Lahore. There he seems to have reached the height of human felicity. A proverb became current, as happy as Akbar. He established his authority in Kabul and Bengal. He added Kashmir to his dominions. His empire was as large as that of Ashoka. During the reign of Burhan, Akbar sent ambassadors to the sultans of the Deccan to invite them to accept him as their suzerain. In return, he would uphold them on their thrones. He would prevent all internecine wars. One and all refused to pay allegiance to the Mogul. Akbar was wroth at the refusal. He sent his son Amurath to command in Gujarat. He ordered Amurath to seize the first opportunity for interfering in the affairs of Ahmadnagar. The moment soon arrived. Burhan died in 1594. A war ensued between rival claimants to the throne. The minister invited Amurath to interfere. Amurath advanced to Ahmadnagar. Meantime, the minister and queen came to terms. They united to resist the Moguls. The Queen Dowager, known as Chand Bibi, arrayed herself in armor. She veiled her face and led the troops in person. The Moguls were driven back. At last a compromise was effected. Berar was ceded to the Padishah. Amurath retired from Ahmadnagar. About this time, a strange event took place at Lahore. On Easter Sunday, 1597, the Padishah was celebrating the Nowruz, the feast of the New Year, in honor of the sun. Tented pavilions were set up in a large plain. An image of the sun, fashioned of gold and jewels, was placed upon a throne. Suddenly, a thunderbolt fell from the skies. The throne was overturned. The royal pavilion was set on fire. The flames spread throughout the camp. The whole was burned to the ground. The fire reached the city and burned down the palace. Nearly everything was consumed. The imperial treasures were melted down, and molten gold and silver ran through the streets of Lahore. The portentous disaster made a deep impression on Akbar. He went away to Kashmir. He took one of the Christian fathers with him. He began to question the propriety of his new religion. He could not bring himself to retract, certainly not to become an open Christian. When the summer was over, he returned to Lahore. In 1598, Akbar left Lahore and set out for Agra. He was displeased with the conduct of the war in the Deccan. His son, Amurath, was a drunkard. The commander-in-chief, known as the Khan Kanan, who accompanied Amurath, was intriguing and treacherous. He had probably been bribed by the Deccani's. Abul Fazl was still the trusted servant and friend. He had been raised to the rank of commander of 2,500. Akbar had already recalled the Khan Kanan. He now sent Abul Fazl into the Deccan to bring away Amurath, or to send him away as should seem most expedient. Abul Fazl departed on his mission. He arrived at Burhanpur, the capital of Khandesh. He soon discovered the lukewarmness of Bahadur Khan, the ruler. He insisted that Bahadur Khan should join him and help the imperial cause. Bahadur Khan was disinclined to help Akbar to conquer the Deccan. He thought to back out by sending rich presents to Abul Fazl. He returned the presents and went alone towards Ahmednagar. Meanwhile, Amurath was retreating from Ahmednagar. He encamped in Berar. He drank more deeply than ever. He died very suddenly the very day that Abul Fazl came up. The death of Amurath removed one complication, but it led to the question of advance. The imperial officers urged a retreat. Abul Fazl had been bred in a cloister. He was approaching his 50th year. He had never before been in active service, but he had the spirit of a soldier. He refused to retreat from an enemy's country. He pushed manfully on for Ahmednagar. His efforts were rewarded with success. The Queen Regent was assailed by other enemies and yielded to her fate. She agreed that if Abul Fazl would punish her enemies, she would surrender the fortress of Ahmednagar. Tidings had now reached Akbar that his son Amurath was dead. He resolved to go in person to the Deccan. He left his eldest son, Selim, in charge of the government. He sent an advance force under his other son, Daniel, associated with the Khan Kanan. The advance force reached Burhanpur. There the disloyalty of Bahadur Khan was manifest. He refused to pay respect to Daniel. Akbar was encamped in Ujjain when the news reached him. He ordered Abul Fazl to join him. He ordered Daniel to go on to Ahmednagar. He then prepared for the subjugation of Bahadur Khan. The story of the operations may be told in a few words. Daniel advanced to Ahmednagar. Chand Bibi was slaughtered by her own soldiers. Ahmednagar was occupied by the Moguls. Meanwhile, Bahadur Khan abandoned Burhanpur and took refuge in the strong fortress of Asirgur. Akbar was joined by Abul Fazl and laid siege to Asirgur. The siege lasted 6 months. At last Bahadur Khan surrendered. His life was spared. Henceforth he fades away from history. So far Akbar had prospered. He had conquered the great highway into the Deccan, Malwa, Khandesh, Berar, and Ahmadnagar. He raised Abul Fazl to the command of 4,000. He resolved on conquering the Deccan. He was about to strike when his arm was arrested. His eldest son Selim had broken out in revolt. He had gone to Allahabad and assumed the title of Padishah. Akbar returned alone to Agra. He was falling on evil days. He effected a reconciliation with Selim. He saw that Selim was still rebellious at heart, that his best officers were inclining toward his undutiful son. In his perplexity he sent to the Deccan for Abul Fazl. The trusted servant hastened to join his imperial master, but Selim had always hated Abul Fazl. He instigated a Rajput chief of Bundelkund to waylay Abul Fazl. This chief was Bir Singh of Urcha. Bir Singh fell upon Abul Fazl near Nawar, killed him, and sent his head to Selim. Bir Singh fled from the wrath of the Padishah. He led the life of an outlaw in the jungle until he heard of the death of Akbar. Akbar was deeply wounded by the murder of Abul Fazl. He thereby lost his chief support, his best trusted friend. Henceforth he seemed to yield to circumstances rather than to struggle against the world. Other misfortunes befell him. His mother died. His youngest son, Danyal, killed himself with drink in the Deccan. His own life was beginning to draw to a close. The last events in the reign of Akbar are obscure. Outwardly he became reconciled to Selim. Outwardly he abandoned skepticism and heresy. He professed himself a Mussulman. At heart he was anxious that Selim should be set aside, that Khusru, the eldest son of Selim, should succeed him to the throne. It is impossible to unravel the intrigues that filled the court at Agra. At last Akbar was smitten with mortal disease. For some days Selim was refused admittance to his father's chamber. In the end there was a compromise. Selim swore to maintain the Mussulman religion. He also swore to pardon his son Khusru and all who had supported Khusru. He was then brought into the presence of Akbar. The old Padishah was past all speech. He made a sign with his hand that Selim should take the imperial diadem and gird on the imperial sword. Selim obeyed. He prostrated himself upon the ground before the couch of his dying father. He touched the ground with his head. He then left the chamber. A few hours had passed away, and Akbar was dead. He died in October 1605, aged 63. The burial of Akbar was performed after a simple fashion. His grave was prepared in a garden at Secundra, about 4 miles from Agra. The body was placed upon a bier. Selim and his 3 sons carried it out of the fortress. The young princess, assisted by the officers of the imperial household, carried it to Secundra. 7 days were spent in mourning over the grave. Provisions and sweetmeats were distributed among the poor every morning and evening throughout the morning. 20 readers were appointed to recite the Quran every night without ceasing. Finally, the foundations were laid of that splendid mausoleum which is known far and wide as the tomb of Akbar. End of section 34. End of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.